David asked. Chuckling, Mac said, "He was a McGuire. That's why. You really don't know anything about politics." He turned his attention back to Gibbons's fate. "Maybe the killer decided not to stop with Freddie, but the crooked prosecutor that let him escape." "That's a lot of maybes," David said. "Gibbons ran off to Europe. If that was revenge, they would have had to find out what country he'd run off to, fly overseas, and hunt him down in that country to kill him. Gibbons was murdered." Stunned, Mac repeated the word murdered over and over again while leafing through the reports in the file. Peering at the bottom of his empty coffee mug, David said, "Granted, we don't have any of the evidence on hand for the Gibbons murder, but I can't help thinking it's far-fetched to assume that it would be connected to our case." Mac replied, "Most likely Gibbons's parents came to McGuire to find out who killed their son. I assume, since he was the one behind helping Freddie escape prosecution and getting out of the country, he's probably the only one who would have given enough of a damn to help them find out what happened to him." "Did the P.I. find anything?" "The clerk at the hostel said that Gibbons had a beautiful American woman with him when he checked in." Mac repeated, "She was an American." David argued, "There's a lot of American women in Europe. Gibbons was a sexual predator that killed one of his victims. This woman could have been getting even with him for a rape he'd committed over there after leaving here." Mac shuffled the Gibbons folder to the bottom of the stack and read the label on the next one. "Jillian Keating. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." David's eyebrows met at the center of his forehead. "Another case in that folder rings a bell? 8 years ago, you couldn't turn on the news without seeing Jillian Keating." Mac thumbed through the pages in the file to refresh his memory. "Usual case. Andrew Keating was in his 70s. She was late 20s. Whirlwind romance. He married her in Vegas, where she'd been a stripper. Days after the honeymoon ended, she poisoned him. I caught her. Defense got my evidence suppressed, saying the warrant wasn't valid." He laid his hand flat on top of the file. "Guess who her defense lawyer was?" "Who?" "Natasha Homestead," Mac told him. "McGuire's wife. The Keating case was the first time I got to see Homestead up close and personal. She got Jillian Keating off." He growled deep in his throat. "I can still see the smirk on Jillian Keating's face when she left the courthouse and climbed into the back of her limo after the case had been dismissed. I wanted to throttle her. In the same way you wanted to do Gibbons. In cases like that, where you know who the killer is and the killer knows you know, but you see them walk away," Max sighed, "when you actually see them walk away and they look you right in the eye and there's nothing you can do. There's no way you can make it right. Justice is completely out of your reach." He swallowed. "Cases like that haunt me." "Who blew the prosecution? McGuire?" Mac recalled. "George Vance was the prosecutor in the first chair on that case. That was a couple of years before he became deputy U.S. attorney. Vance is good, nothing like McGuire. He was as furious as I was when Keating got off. When Sutherland ruled to suppress my evidence, we ended up with nothing. Everybody knew she did it, but if the jury wasn't allowed to hear about the poison, then there was no way they'd convict. There'd be reasonable doubt. Makes me wonder." David asked, "What makes you wonder?" "Theoretically, Sutherland and Homestead are on opposite sides," Max said. "I remember back when Sutherland was a prosecutor. He was passionate about getting the bad guys off the street. Homestead has gotten the slimiest of slime released. He tossed out my poison in the Keating case, and now they're living together. I can't believe he's dirty, though. Since they've gotten together, he removes himself from any cases that she's defense counsel on." David stretched across the table to read the label for the next file, which was Leo Samuel. "You already told me about Samuels. What's in that last folder?" He slid the case file in Mac's direction. "Hogan, first name Gerald." Mac turned the file around in order for him to read the label. Jerry Hogan. He scanned the narrative until he recalled the case. This wasn't my case, but I do remember it. Rape and murder following a college fraternity party. A freshman girl went to a frat party and had too much to drink. Jerry Hogan offered her a ride home. Only he slipped something into her last drink. He raped and strangled her. The case made it to trial. The prosecution had all the evidence they needed, but his lawyer put the victim on trial. They found where she'd uploaded some dirty videos of herself with S&M paraphernalia onto the internet and showed them to the jury. The defense claimed that she consented to the sex and the strangulation was an accident. Let me guess, David growled. The jury refused to convict. It was hung. Prosecution saw no point in trying again since they knew the defense would trot out that video. David spun the list of names around to read them over. From what you're telling me, these are all cases of killers who got off. Agreeing, Mac recounted Natasha's visit to Spencer Manor. She told me that McGuire was investigating old cases in order to cause a scandal so he could be appointed U.S. attorney. Do you think something dirty was happening behind the scenes that got all these murderers off? Sitting back in his seat, Mac thought back over the events behind each of the cases. While waiting for his answer, the police chief collected the files and replaced them in the accordion folder. Knowing the attorneys on each of these cases, Mac finally said, the only one I would have suspected of taking a bribe to let a killer off would be McGuire. But he was the one digging this up and the one that got killed. He certainly wasn't any candidate for Good Guy of the Year, David said. Even so, he had his list of cases for a reason. It looks like, if we want to find out who killed him and why, we have to look back through them, too. Keeping his hand on the list of names, Mac watched David seal the accordion folder. He wanted to smuggle the list home, to ask Archie to research the cases in order to uncover the common thread between them. There had to be more of a connection than they had all escaped justice. Give me the list, Mac. David held his hand out to him. What else have you got? Hand me the list, David snapped his fingers. Before you let me see that folder, you didn't know what the list of names meant. Now you know, Mac said. I've cooperated with you. The least you can do is let me see the crime scene pictures and evidence box. I told you enough already. David snatched the paper from his hand. As a matter of fact, I told you more than you have any need to know. A tap at the door by one of his officers signaled the end of their interview. The police chief was needed outside. After unsealing the folder again to place the list inside and gathering everything he brought into the room, they went out into the hall. The commotion in the reception area could be heard throughout the station. Tanya stood back while Bogey, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, tried to contain Stephen McGuire's assistant. They belonged to the office of the United States Attorney, Hamilton Sanders argued. His face was as red as his hair, which was so curly that it looked like he could bounce a ping-pong ball on top of his head. Based purely on a calculation of the number of years that he'd been a lawyer with the U.S. Attorney's Office, Mac knew that Hamilton had to be in his mid-30s. Between the freckles on his baby face and his skinny frame clothed in an oversized suit, he looked like a teenager in his daddy's clothes. Spying David with his gold chief's badge pinned to his chest, he rushed to plead his case while raising his voice in order to drown out any potential opposition from the deputy chief. Chief O'Callahan, I am Hamilton Sanders. I have a letter here from United States Attorney Boris Hunter asking you to please turn over any case files you found in Stephen McGuire's room or otherwise in his possession. He waved his letter in front of David's face and chest in a non-verbal order for him to take and read it and do so now. They're the property of the federal government and classified. We can't risk them falling into the wrong hands. Really, David replied. I was planning to make copies of them and post them onto the World Wide Web. Not realizing the police chief was joking, the lawyer gasped. You can't do that. He's not serious, Ham. Mac shook his head at David to inform him that Hamilton Sanders didn't have a sense of humor. Hamilton told him, "Lieutenant Faraday, you have no authority in this case. You aren't even a detective anymore. Stephen McGuire was murdered at my inn. That makes his murder my business." "That plus him breaking up your marriage makes you a suspect," Hamilton countered. "Chief, I hate to be one telling you how to run your investigation, but it really isn't wise making suspects privy to the details of your case." Hugging the accordion folder tight against his chest, as if he feared the attorney would make a grab for it, David replied, "No less wise than handing over evidence to a suspect." Hamilton gasped, "I resent that." Instructing her to lock everything up, David handed the accordion folder and notepad to Tanya. The thick, clumsy folder caused her to buckle under its heavy weight. "About those files, Chief," the attorney said, while watching them disappear up the stairs to David's secure file room. "Tell your boss he'll get them when I'm through with them," David said. "I can't tell him that." Hamilton waved the unread letter in his face until David took it from him. "He sent me here with the express order to retrieve them ASAP. Mac asked, "Why did McGuire take them and bring them to Spencer in the first place?" Hamilton glared at Mac for his intrusion into their conversation before turning back to David, who pointed out, "The man asked you a question." Hamilton said, "I don't have to answer him." David replied, "But you do have to answer me. If not, then I'll get the answer directly from your boss." "Background work for an upcoming murder case, I suppose," Stephen McGuire's assistant said. "Mr. Hunter is asking you nicely for the return of those case files. He knows a lot of powerful people. One phone call, and he can have me back here with a court order for you to turn them over." "If he knows a Maryland judge who would put your runaway case files ahead of potential evidence in solving a murder, then tell him to go for it." David took a step toward Hamilton, who backed up at his advance. "In the meantime, they're not going anywhere." Wagging a finger in David's face, Hamilton's voice shook when he announced, "You haven't seen the last of me," before scurrying out the door. Chapter 7. Mac concluded there was something wrong with his psyche. When David finally agreed to permit him to see the crime scene photos and evidence collected for Christine's and Stephen McGuire's murders, his heart leapt, not unlike it used to when, as a child, he would wake up on Christmas morning in anticipation of unwrapping his presents under the tree. Maybe it was genetic. While reading his late mother's journal, Mac discovered that Robin Spencer expressed similar anticipation upon delving into a new murder investigation. Yes, she acknowledged the tragedy of someone's life being snatched away from them by another, but she also marveled at the challenge of piecing together a puzzle which, in the end, could bring justice for the victim and closure for the family. He wanted to have that closure for his children. He didn't want them to go through life not knowing what had happened to their mother. "Did you know about someone trying to kill Stephen McGuire a couple of weeks ago?" Mac asked, when he followed David into his corner office on the top floor of the police station. With the view of the boat dock and lake and a 4-foot fish mounted above the stone fireplace, his office didn't resemble that of any police chief Mac had met in the past. "I found that out the same day you found his body," David said. "I had a nice long talk with the investigating officer in Georgetown. He even sent me a copy of the file." He set a black suitcase on the conference table. A slip of paper for the chain of evidence was connected to the strap. "This is the suitcase we found in McGuire's room." After checking the time on his watch, he signed the log slip. "Why didn't you say anything to me about it?" Mac asked, "about the poisoning, while opening the suitcase?" "I couldn't say anything until I officially cleared you as a suspect." David slipped the lid off the evidence box. "Here's what happened. A couple of weeks after he left Christine, McGuire went to a retirement party at some swanky club in Washington. Everyone who was anyone was there, including Christine. Around 4 in the morning, McGuire called 911. A couple days later, the doctors figured out he'd been poisoned with arsenic. Luckily, it wasn't a fatal dose, but he was in the hospital for a week. Do the police in Washington suspect Christine of poisoning him? Mac asked, while examining Stephen McGuire's clothes. The suitcase contained a few changes of clothes, nicely tailored ones. He didn't scrimp on his wardrobe. She was at the party, and McGuire went to the trouble of getting a restraining order against her, David said. Of course, she became a person of interest when the police heard about the scene she caused at the party when she saw him talking to another woman. It sounded very similar to the scene she caused in the inn's lobby, yet they couldn't connect her to the arsenic. Max said. His wife, Natasha Homestead, who inherited all of his estate, was also at the party. Do you buy the bull she's selling about looking for an old watch? David took a mini laptop from the box and laid it on the table. Of course not, Mac replied. There's no gold pocket watch among McGuire's stuff. A gold watch, but not a pocket watch. He'd packed light. She's lying, like all lawyers, except Willingham and Fleming. No, they'd never lie, David said, with a note of sarcasm. Homestead is good at what she does, Mac admitted. I know that there are innocent people who've been accused of murder. Our country's justice system is based on everyone getting a fair trial. Where would we be if the accused didn't have the right to the best lawyer they could afford or get? But, he gritted his teeth as faces of murder victims he'd encountered during his career flashed through his mind. Seeing and knowing what juries haven't been allowed to see and know, because of the likes of Natasha Homestead, convincing some judges to suppress evidence, allowing killers to walk out. He sighed while shaking his head. But she's just doing her job, and making a hell of a lot of money doing it. While gesturing at the other contents in the box, David held up a set of keys and a gold chain with a small pocket knife attached to it. We found all this on the table in his suite. It looked like he was working on something when he left to go upstairs to the penthouse. Mac took the keychain and studied it. The forensics lab searched all his electronics inside and out. David showed him a picture of a cell phone. They found something very interesting on McGuire's cell phone and laptop. His phone had a tracking program loaded on it. It was set up to send his text messages, call logs, emails sent and received, as well as its GPS location to a clone phone. Setting another picture of a cell phone next to the first, David announced, "This cell phone, which we found in Christine's suitcase." "Maybe it was planted," Max said. "It has her fingerprints on it," David replied. "If Christine had McGuire under surveillance, she had to know that he was staying at the inn. Are you sure it was your idea that she stay there?" "Positive." David continued. His laptop had a similar type of spyware that allowed someone with the laptop to monitor what he was doing, including check his email and examine what he had on his hard drive or flash. "Did you find the laptop used to monitor him among her belongings?" Max set the keychain in the box. "No, we didn't," Max said. "Christine wasn't one bit technically inclined." David hesitated before responding. 2 weeks ago, she purchased a clone phone and a new laptop, which we suspect was used to keep track of McGuire. I'm sorry, Mac, but between finding these surveillance programs, her arriving in town the same day he checked into the inn, and finding the clone in her suitcase, it looks like Christine was stalking him. But someone else was in that room. Mac studied the pictures of the two phones. "Did you find any external hard drive or flash drives in the room?" "Nope, only the laptop." Mac opened the laptop and hit the button to turn it on. "Both Archie and I have one of these. It's built for portability. You can't store a lot on the hard drive. You need a flash drive for file storage." "Found none." "Maybe the killer stole the flash drive containing information about what McGuire was doing here." He shut the laptop off and closed the lid. "Maybe, but he didn't get this." David held up a business card for him to read the name. While Mac didn't recognize the name, he did recognize the title, Private Investigator. The name was listed as Nancy Brenner. McGuire had hired a private investigator. "And I know her," David said. "I've got an appointment to see her later. Want to take a road trip?" After getting David's invitation to ride along for the interview with the private investigator, Mac swung past Spencer Manor to change out of the sports jacket and slacks he had worn for his breakfast meeting and into comfortable blue jeans and a sweater. After discovering that Gnarly had shredded one of the pillows on his bed, he realized he hadn't taken the dog for a walk since the murders. Gnarly's trainer insisted that boredom was the root to his misbehavior. This being the case, the German Shepherd was invited to go along for the ride. "Have you met Sandy Bennett yet?" David asked Mac during the drive out to Nancy Brenner's home across the West Virginia state line in Morgantown. As if he expected Gnarly to know the answer, Mac turned to look at the German Shepherd filling the back seat. With the dark patches above his eyes knitted together into a questioning expression, he looked like he was replying that he didn't know either. The dog resumed peering out at the trees and cows in the hillside pastures along the mountain roads. "The name sounds familiar," Mac replied. "She's in a few of Robin's books," David said. "Robin based her on Nancy Brenner. She had the honor of being one of the first women sworn in as a West Virginia state trooper. Back around when I was born, Dad had met her when one of his cases spilled over the state line. He said she was the best, and she was. He introduced her to your mother, who created the character of Sandy Bennett, based on Nancy." The reference to Robin's books jogged Mac's memory. Sandy Bennett was a police officer that Mickey Forsythe would sometimes work with during his investigations. Her sexy beauty disguised a quick wit and deadly aim with her gun. David recounted Nancy Brenner's story. "She retired around the same time Dad passed away. She's got 5 grandchildren. Same year Nancy retired, her husband got a doctor to sign off on some disease that I'd never heard of, and will never be able to pronounce, to be put on permanent disability. He sits in front of the television, drinking beer all day long." "What a life," Max said with sarcasm. "I think Nancy got her PI license and went back to work because she didn't want to join him." Once he'd crossed the state line, David took an exit onto a side road that wound through the countryside until he found Nancy Brenner's double-wide mobile home on a hilltop south of Morgantown. "There she is." David climbed out of the cruiser and opened the back door. Gnarly took off for the nearest tree to mark the property as his. Nancy Brenner didn't look like any P.I. Mac had ever encountered before. Private eyes he had met during his career were hard-drinking men who wore a lifetime of battling the system on their faces. Others were opportunists who'd retired and moved into the high-tech field of security work to sit behind desks and swap war stories with other mid-level management types. Nancy Brenner didn't fit either of those profiles. At first, Mac had expected Nancy Brenner to be inside the home. He thought the woman on her knees in an oversized men's work shirt digging in the dirt to plant mums was the retired cop's mother or aunt. She certainly wasn't the same woman which Robin Spencer had created into a female crime fighter. With an order to Gnarly not to dig up the flowers as fast as she was planting them, David stepped across the lawn. "Hey, Aunt Nancy." Nancy shaded her eyes with her hand and spade and squinted up at them. "My God." After hugging her, David introduced her to Mac. "He's Robin's son." While she shook his hand, she studied his face with an eye that he recognized as being that of a well-trained investigator. Mac could see why Robin Spencer had been intrigued by the female police officer. Even on the wrong side of middle age, she was very attractive. The lines that had crept up onto her face only enhanced her cheekbones. The silver in her blonde hair shone in the autumn sun. "So you're Robin's son," Mac replied. "That's what the DNA tests say." "What does your DNA say about your daddy?" She glanced from Mac to David and then back again. The corner of her lips curled into a knowing grin. "Don't need any DNA samples to know the answer to that. The eyes alone say it all." When she finally released her grip on his hand, he turned to David. The eyebrow over David's left eye rose into an arch. If Nancy Brenner had been born a decade later, she probably could have worked her way up from patrol to investigations. "Well, what do you two boys want to talk to me about?" She went over to the porch where she had a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of sugar cookies waiting. "I take it you're here about Stephen McGuire?" She took off her gloves and poured the lemonade into a glass. Sticking his thumbs into his utility belt, David leaned against the porch rail. "How'd you guess?" "I'm retired, but not brain-dead." She looked him over. "I must say that gold badge looks as good on you as it did on your daddy." She reached out to brush her fingers across it. "You're every bit as handsome as he was." "Thank you for the compliment." "How are you adjusting to the rich life?" she asked Mac. "What's it like going from underpaid cop to big man on the point?" This wasn't the first time anyone had asked Mac about adjusting from the middle-class suburban lifestyle of pinching pennies to having more than he could ever need. Before, he would grin, chuckle, and say it's great. That was before someone murdered Christine and Stephen McGuire. While David was in on every clue, Mac had been shut out. With all his financial worries gone and living in the stone manor on Spencer Point, he felt like the pampered pooch with the rhinestone collar, cooped up inside the mansion, watching the junkyard dogs chasing the cat down the street, and so wanting to be one of them. "Retirement takes some adjusting to," he said. "Ever thought of getting a PI license?" Her tone was serious. "I may do that," Mac replied. "Mickey Forsythe, look out." She laughed before asking them, "What do you want to know about Stephen McGuire?" "Did he hire you?" David asked. She scoffed. "You know the drill, Dave. My files are confidential. If it gets out that I'm blabbing, especially to the cops, about one of my clients, then no one will trust me and I'll be out of business." She gazed at him with the prettiest expression she could muster, while being on the wrong side of 50. "The girl has to make a living." "McGuire is dead," David reminded her. "I know that all too well," she said. "Someone offed him before he paid his bill. Do you really think the McGuire family is going to care about the whining of an old lady?" Mac grinned. "Suppose I paid his bill." That was enough to make Nancy take her eyes off David's handsome face. "Are you serious?" "How much?" David took his billfold out of his back pocket. "If I pay his bill, that makes me your client. You give us the full report." She craned her neck to count the bills he was taking from his wallet. After he extracted them from the billfold, she snatched them from his hand, folded them up, and stuffed them into her bra. "Deal." She tapped him on the chest while flashing him a smile. "I'll even give you a receipt." "McGuire was seen with a young woman on the day he was killed," David said. "You know who she was?" "You said young," Nancy noted. "Did she have copper-colored hair? Very skinny?" David looked to Mac, who had seen her, to confirm the description, which he did with a single nod of his head. "She says she's McGuire's long-lost daughter," Nancy answered. "McGuire hired me a couple of weeks ago. About 20 years ago, he had a fling with a young woman named Connie Hughes while they were students at Ohio State University. They broke it off, and she never told him that he was a daddy-to-be. She was a real independent sort and raised the girl on her own. Then, 2 weeks ago, this girl calls up McGuire, calling him Daddy. She says her mommy had passed away 8 years ago, and she just found out about him. Real soon after that, she had her hand out asking for money. Since she was going to college here in Morgantown, he called me to check her out. I got the impression that he never parted with cash unless he had to." David asked, "What did you find out?" The girl's story checked out up to a point. Yeah, the mom died 8 years ago, at which point Connie Hughes's daughter, Rebecca, moved to Traverse City, Michigan, to live with her grandparents. She's currently a student at Michigan Tech. Gnarly sat up. His nose pointed up the hill across from them, a growl deep in his throat. "Easy, Gnarly." Mac observed, "That's a long way from Morgantown." Nancy agreed. "According to the profile pictures on Rebecca Hughes's Facebook friend page, the girl that contacted McGuire is really Cameron Jones. They were friends in middle school. Cameron spent all of her time in college majoring in sex, drugs, and hip-hop, and flunked out real fast. Her parents still don't know. As soon as they do, they'll cut her off without a cent. I assume that's why she decided to look up McGuire and pretend to be his long-lost daughter." David asked, "Did you tell Stephen McGuire all this?" "The day he got killed," she said. "He told me that he was going to let Cameron Jones hang herself." "Shortly after which he ended up dead," Mac said. "She didn't do it," Nancy said. David wanted to know, "How can you be so sure?" "I'm not an amateur," she said. "No one goes killing my clients before I get paid. I checked into it myself. After the scene with Christine Faraday at the Spencer Inn, McGuire did confront Jones. He'd recorded the whole conversation on his phone, got her trying to shake him down, threatening to reveal his illegitimate daughter, which I'm sure wouldn't have gone down well with his high society family. The whole extortion. He produced the recording and told her that on account of him being such a nice guy, he was going to let her off easy. If she turned around and walked away and never came back, then he wasn't going to have her arrested for fraud and attempted extortion. I guess Cameron Jones did have a brain in her head, because that's what she did." David said, "We found no recordings among McGuire's personal effects. He recorded it with his phone. She cried to my source about the whole thing." Mac was impressed. "Who's your source?" "The bartender at iPooley. It's a cyber cafe joint right off WVU campus. Students go in to drink themselves silly while being sucked into virtual worlds and games. Cameron practically lives there, twittering on her laptop and snorting coke in the parking lot. That's where she was from shortly after 7 until iPooley closed. She went home with a boyfriend who deals coke out in the club parking lot. If you don't believe that, check with the Morgantown police. Loverboy's been a person of interest in the drug scene for quite some time. They've been watching him, which means they can alibi Cameron." "Sounds to me like she might blame McGuire for ruining this dream she had of him bankrolling her way into the party life," David said. Gnarly stood up and barked at the hill. Petting the dog, Nancy peered up the hill. "What do you see, boy?" Mac asked her, "Since this place is a hangout for such lowlifes, do you think Cameron may be twisted enough to hire one of her boyfriend's associates to wreak her revenge on McGuire by killing him?" "Even if one of these geniuses had the smarts to figure out how to pull off a murder at the Spencer Inn, she had no money to pay for a hit." She reached around behind her back. "Excuse me, I think you boys better duck." "She was a college girl with a body. What more—" David was saying, when Nancy drew a handgun from a holster she'd been wearing under her work shirt and plowed into him with her full body to knock him to the ground into her freshly planted mums. A potted mum waiting on the porch railing to be planted exploded. Gnarly's bark sounded like a wild animal's roar in the jungle. The next shot from the hillside shattered the lemonade pitcher. Drawing his gun, Mac dove to take cover behind a tree. "They're using an automatic rifle up there on top of the hill," she called out to Mac. "I saw the sun reflect off the scope. That's what your dog was barking at." While Mac covered them with a round of shots from his gun, David and Nancy rolled together through the flower bed until David was able to reach around her to get his gun out of its holster on his utility belt. They ended up behind the wheelbarrow, which David overturned for them to use for cover. Gnarly charged down the sidewalk and out into the road. Mac didn't need any more information. Gnarly led the way across the road in the direction of the hillside. Sounding his alarm, Gnarly charged up the steep hill to a roadside park and playground. In the middle of a school day, it was vacant. By the time Mac caught up to him, Gnarly was sniffing around a bench between two trees that looked out across the valley. The back of the bench provided a brace to rest the rifle in order to take 2 shots 75 yards down the hill to the house with a police cruiser in front of it. Mac knelt down to examine the ground where Gnarly was sniffing. The 2 rifle casings in the grass were still hot to the touch. Good dog. Gnarly didn't stick around for more praise. The scent was still hot. He took off again toward the parking lot on the other side of the playground. The black Ford SUV barely missed the dog when it careened around the corner and hit the ditch before swinging out onto the road to make its getaway onto the interstate. Chapter 8. Who does the caddy belong to? David rolled the police cruiser between the stone pillars and up the circle driveway to Spencer Manor's front door. A black Cadillac SUV blocked the entrance to the stone path from the driveway to the wraparound porch. It was only one person Mac knew that the Cadillac could belong to. She bought the latest model Cadillacs with the same frequency that Archie upgraded her technological gadgets. Christine's sister. Mac's tone alone conveyed everything the police chief needed to know about his ex-in-laws. David couldn't hear the rest of his reply over Gnarly's barking, which erupted when the cruiser passed the oak tree at the corner of the Manor's wraparound porch. His snarling snout smeared dog drool on the back window in his fervor to get out. When Mac released him from the back of the cruiser, Gnarly charged as if he'd forgotten that he couldn't climb trees. What's gotten into him? David looked up into the branches to see the source of Gnarly's fury. Otis, Mac answered, while bracing for the scene he suspected was awaiting him inside the Manor. Archie says there's some giant squirrel that's been tormenting him. David pointed his finger up toward the top of the tree. That's the fattest squirrel I've ever seen. When an acorn flew out of the tree to bounce off the top of the cruiser, he yelled, "Hey, did you see that? That piggy squirrel threw an acorn at my cruiser. Gnarly, I'm gonna kill you." Between getting shot at, the shepherd's barking, and his ex-in-laws waiting inside, Mac was ready for an early cocktail. "Well, it's about time," Sabrina immediately called out from the living room when Mac, David, and Gnarly stepped into the foyer. He hadn't seen either of his ex-sisters-in-law since they had accompanied Christine to the courthouse in a show of support when their divorce became final. After that hearing, Edward Willingham, senior manager of Willingham and Associates, had chased Mac 3 city blocks before convincing him that he had indeed inherited $270 million from the birth mother he never knew. In a black ensemble suitable for mourning, Sabrina Carrington filled the leather wing-back chair in the corner of the living room. Dripping in ruby jewels, she resembled a queen on her throne, holding court, with her surviving sister playing the role of princess-in-waiting on the sofa across the room. In a black pantsuit void of any jewels to brighten it up, Roxanne Burton contrasted her sister. She wasn't only dressed the part, she was indeed in mourning. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her face was drawn and pale. With only 11 months between them, Roxanne and Christine had been more than sisters. They were the best of friends. So close in age and similar in beauty and body type, they'd served together as professional cheerleaders for Washington's football team. Signed by the same agency, they'd worked together as models to pay for their college education. Archie came in from the kitchen bearing a serving tray with tea for them after their long drive from Washington. "I was beginning to think you'd deserted your children in their time of need to go off on one of your crazy adventures with one of your friends." Sabrina directed Archie to leave her English tea on the end table. When unable to decide between the sugar cookie or the tea biscuit, she took both, after Archie informed her that they had plenty. After admiring the exquisite herringbone china cup, Sabrina took a sip of the tea, which prompted a sour expression and a squawk that resembled the honk of a goose. "This is nothing more than hot water. Don't you know how to let tea steep?" Archie turned around from where she was about to return to the kitchen. "We can steep it a few more minutes." "Do." Sabrina ordered the tea taken away with a wave of both her hands. "This is totally unacceptable." The roll of Archie's eyes told the two men that the sisters were everything Mac had warned her about. She returned to the kitchen with the rejected teapot. Having seen enough of the visitors, Gnarly, his tail between his legs, followed at her heels. When Mac heard the door slam in the kitchen, he guessed that she wouldn't be returning until after their visitors were gone. The matter of the tea taken care of, Sabrina looked up to notice that both Mac and David were covered in soil after their run-in at Nancy Brenner's house. "What happened to you?" "Someone took a couple of shots at us," Mac said. "People are always shooting at you," Sabrina scoffed between bites of her cookie. "Your day isn't complete until you get shot at least twice." "Oh, Mac!" Roxanne leaped off the couch and threw her arms around his neck. The embrace was so unexpected that a lock of her auburn hair went up his nose. Roxanne had never made it a secret that she believed he wasn't good enough for her little sister. The last time Mac recalled them embracing was on his wedding day, after Christine had ordered them to do so. Roxanne continued to hold on to him while sobbing into his sweater. "Chris didn't deserve to die like that. I was supposed to take care of her." She dissolved into incoherent blubbering. Over the sobs, Mac introduced David to them as Spencer's police chief. When he added that David was investigating the murders, Roxanne erupted with a fresh round of sobs. "I'm sorry you had to wait," Mac apologized. "I didn't know you were coming." "That's okay. Your girl has been taking very good care of us, though she's a little slow with that tea." When Sabrina waved her hand, her jewels caught the rays of the sun streaming through the window. "I'm glad you're here, Chief. You were going to be my next stop. What progress have you made in finding the killer?" Bracing to be interrogated, David stepped further into the room. With Sabrina refusing to budge out of the chair, Mac and he resembled army generals reporting on the war's progress to the Queen. "We're making progress." "Do you have any suspects yet?" "A few," David answered. "Who?" "I can't say." "Why not?" Sabrina demanded to know. "Because I don't believe in showing my hand until it's time to show my cards," the police chief replied. Sabrina's voice was low and threatening when she told him, "Christine was my sister. When you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. I want to know what happened. Was it an accident, or did someone kill her?" "She was drunk," Roxanne said. "She'd called me that night from the penthouse, and she was out of her mind. I told her to get something to eat and go to bed and sleep it off, but she was crazy out of her mind. She kept saying that she was going to kill Stephen." She sobbed. "I never thought she would have done it." "Someone else was in that room," David told them. "Who?" Sabrina asked. "We don't know yet." "Are you sure?" Roxanne's eyes filled with fresh tears. David said, "We're finding evidence that others wanted Stephen McGuire dead. There's a possibility that Christine was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Someone did try to poison him a couple of weeks ago," Sabrina said. David turned to Roxanne. "The Washington police told us that you were on the scene of that incident." Mac hadn't thought it was possible for Roxanne's face to become paler, but it did. "Only because I dragged Christine there," she answered the police chief. "I thought it would do her good to go out and meet other people." Sabrina said, "They couldn't prove that Christine had any connection to whatever it was Stephen ate that was poisoned." Roxanne explained, "I finally convinced the investigators that if they didn't have any proof she did it, then to leave her alone. They didn't, so they did." "That was after I made a few phone calls." Sabrina caught David's eye. "It pays to have friends." "Who else at that party would have slipped that arsenic to McGuire?" David asked Roxanne. "Everyone was there," she said. "His wife Natasha was there. She hated the air he breathed." "But McGuire didn't get a restraining order issued against Natasha Homestead," the chief pointed out. "He got the order issued against Christine after he'd been poisoned." Sabrina bristled. That was a political move on his part. He did that to make Roxanne look bad so that he'd get appointed deputy U.S. attorney instead of her. Was there anyone on his enemy list named Nita? Mac asked, thinking about the servant who had slipped into the inn. Mexican, maybe? Didn't speak a word of English. Sabrina let out a laugh. Nita? That sounds like that girl I had working for us for a few years. Who? David asked. A few years ago I had a cleaning woman working for me, Sabrina said with a wave of her hand. It was purely charity on my part. She had family in South America that she was trying to bring to the United States. She pointed across the room at her sister. She worked for you first. That's how she came to work for me. Roxanne said, Everyone felt sorry for her. She worked in housekeeping at the courthouse. She spoke very little English and was desperate for money to have her family brought here. So a bunch of us would have her clean our houses and we'd pay her under the table. She worked for me for quite a few years, Sabrina said, which she was totally inadequate at doing anyway. Then I had to drive her home, and she would be talking at me and didn't speak any English. Thank God I remembered it from when we were kids. I tell you, her working for us brought it all back to me. We used to speak fluent Spanish when Big Daddy was the ambassador in Brazil. Then, after coming back to the United States and not using it, but when Nita worked for us, it all came back, like riding a bike. But Portuguese is Brazil's native language, David said. The glare Sabrina shot in the police chief's direction prompted a chuckle from Mac. The correction exposed the underlying message that Sabrina was truly relaying. She was a former ambassador's daughter, and a woman of importance to be treated as such. Actually, Mac explained to him, before they went to Brazil, Christine and her sisters learned Spanish from their nanny, who happened to be an illegal immigrant willing to work cheap. Big Daddy took very good care of Nani, Sabrina said. She lived like a queen compared to the other illegals working for our friends' families. Money hasn't changed you one bit, Mac. You're still a bastard, always trying to make us look bad. He went on to explain. When they were in South America, they never bothered learning Portuguese because so many people understood Spanish. Plus, their father sent them to an English-speaking private school. I did learn Portuguese. So did Roxanne. Sabrina pointed across the room at her sister. She speaks both languages like a native. Nita spoke Spanish. Roxanne returned to the subject of the maid. She was from a tiny village, where in South America I don't remember. Extremely polite. I felt sorry for her until she went weird on us and you ended up firing her. She was weird. Gasping, she snapped her fingers at David. This all happened after Stephen moved in with Christine. She accused him of raping her. He denied it. Of course, no one believed her. I fired her for making such an absurd accusation. Everyone fired her, Roxanne said. She even lost her job at the courthouse. If you raped her, why didn't she report it? David asked. Mac knew the answer. Because Stephen McGuire, with all his powerful friends and connections, could have had her deported. I'm sure he made that very clear to her. Getting her fired was a warning shot of what he could do to her. He asked Sabrina, if she was telling the truth and he raped her and she lost everything, where did that leave her? Sabrina was indignant. At that time, we thought Stephen was a good man. If we knew then what we know now about him... David turned to Mac. It's very possible that if this Nita tracked McGuire down for ruining her life, and Christine, his mistress, happened to be on the scene. What happened to Nita? Mac wanted to know. Do you know where she is now? Roxanne and Sabrina exchanged looks. I have no idea, Sabrina said. The last I heard, she got evicted from the apartment she was living in for non-payment of rent. She could be anywhere, Roxanne said in a soft voice. Even dead, for all we know. Clearing her throat, Sabrina continued on to the reason for her visit. There are a few things that we need to discuss, and I thought it would be best if we discussed them in person. Big Daddy used to say that it was very poor taste to bring up business at a funeral, and since we believe that this should be taken care of before Christine's service, I suggested to Roxanne that we come out to see you. About what? Mac plopped down on the sofa. Christine and I were divorced. All of our business affairs were taken care of months ago. She never changed her will, Sabrina said. You're still her executor and beneficiary. Mac smiled broadly. How about that? Roxanne said. It's about the lake house. We agreed after Big Daddy died that I would buy Sabrina and Christine out of their shares. Her sister interjected. That share being the house and the grounds itself, not necessarily everything in it. Now is not the time to discuss this, Sabrina, Roxanne warned in a low voice. Discuss what? She replied in a mockingly innocent tone. Wordlessly, Roxanne glared at her sister across the room. Curious, David asked. What? Big Daddy's bug. Roxanne's annoyance was evident. Our father had transferred the title to me when he was sick, before he passed away. Because he expected you would keep it in the family, Sabrina said. He never would have given it to you if he knew you were going to sell it. It was a broken-down Volkswagen. It was a classic, Sabrina told David. It was a 1978 VW Beetle convertible. We all learned how to drive in it. My children learned to drive in it. I loved that car. We kept it out here on the lake to use as an extra car to zip around in. We get out here today, and I find that Roxanne has sold it without even offering it to any of us. She snapped her fingers in her sister's direction, as if to make her point. I would have bought it if you'd had the common courtesy to ask. Will you just shut up about the bug already? Roxanne replied. Mac jumped in to say, My lawyer did tell me that Christine's name is still on the deed to the lake house. Because Stephen cheated me, Roxanne said. I refinanced my house to pay both Sabrina and Christine for their shares of the lake house. Sabrina signed the deed transfer to me, but Christine never did. She said she never got the money transfer. When I followed the money, I found when the bank transferred it. It went into her account. When I tried to show her where her account did get the money and suggested that maybe Stephen had transferred it out, since she had put his name on all of her accounts, he convinced her that I was trying to manipulate her. She bought his lies and stopped speaking to me. Sabrina said, Christine was starting to believe us about what a monster Stephen really was when she got killed. Everyone he's touched has had their lives ruined. Where have I heard those words before? Mac asked in a mocking tone. Oh, I know. I said it to both of you when you let him slither into Christine's and my bed. While Roxanne hung her head in shame, Sabrina refused to take any credit for her mistaken judgment. You planned a role in all this, Mac, so we got bought in by Stephen's good looks and charm. Most everybody in D.C. did. But Christine wouldn't have been so easily suckered if you'd treated her right. I did treat her right, Mac claimed. Okay, so I couldn't play keeping up with the sisters. What underpaid homicide detective can? But I put a roof over her head and food on the table and the heat on in the winter. Our kids went to good schools and got everything needed, including braces, and most of what they wanted. Not everything, but most. But according to you, I never gave Christine enough because I couldn't take her on cruises every season or buy her a lake house like Big Daddy's. You made damn sure that she knew that every time you got a chance to flash your newest diamond in her face. He pointed his finger at Sabrina. You asked David here who killed your sister. Look in the mirror, Sabrina. You're the one who did it. You got her killed. You drove her out of a perfectly good marriage and into Stephen McGuire's arms. Mac took pride in being fast and observant on his feet. Before he'd retired, he was ready for anything. He didn't know if retirement had made him soft or as if he'd let his guard down when it came to confronting a middle-aged suburban housewife dripping in rubies. Whatever the case, he wasn't expecting him when Sabrina shot out of her chair like a badger out of its den and delivered a handful of claws across his face. Grabbing his bleeding cheek, Mac retreated backwards, while she advanced with her claws flying to strike any other part of him that she could rip apart. "That's enough," Suddenly David was between the two of them with his arms out, like a traffic cop, stopping traffic in every direction. "Step back." "What's going on in here?" Archie was at Mac's side, while Gnarly was barking as if to demand answers as well. "How dare you talk like that to me? She was my sister. You have no right." In spite of the uniform between her and the man who had dared to offend her, Sabrina continued to charge. With her arms flying in front of her in an effort to slap anyone who got in her way, she continued to advance. Mac grabbed Archie in a bear hug, and the two of them ducked. "I said stop it." David charged toward her with his shoulders down, like a football player taking out the quarterback. His right shoulder catching her in the middle of her chest, he drove the heavy-set woman backwards and off her feet until she landed with a plop in the chair from which she had begun her assault. Silence fell over the manor. Her eyes wide, Sabrina's mouth hung open while she huffed and puffed. Archie examined the scratches on Mac's face. "I've never seen a woman scratch someone so deep, and David said my scratches were impressive. I should put some antiseptic on those." Roxanne's eyes were equally wide while she looked from her sister to David, who straightened his clothes and smoothed his hair. "Consider that a warning," the police chief told Sabrina. "Next time, I won't be so nice." Chapter 9. It was officially off-season on Deep Creek Lake. In a matter of days, the autumn foliage had passed its brilliant height. In the setting sun, house lights that had been concealed by the green leaves in the summer now reflected on the lake. The effect was a colorful, dimensional illusion, visible all the way up to the top of the mountain. Mac hoped he and Archie would have the restaurant to themselves, with Deep Creek Lake's population in hibernation, until ski season. For what they planned to be a night to remember, they both dressed for a dinner for two that Archie had called Antonio to prepare. Archie looked splendid in a sapphire-colored cocktail dress with matching jewels. Mac wore a gray suit with a sapphire-colored shirt to match her dress. Seeming to sense his desire to be alone with her, the servers disappeared after delivering the champagne and bread. "I'm sorry for Sabrina and Roxanne," he apologized, after sipping the champagne. "None of it's your fault," she said. "You did warn me." She took another sip from her glass. "Who do you think did it?" "McGuire had a lot of enemies," Mac said. "I think I was the least of his worries." He pulled the list of names that he had recreated from memory of the list that David had found. "Can you find out what this list means?" She read the names before folding up the sheet of paper and slipping it in her handbag. McGuire had that list in a folder labeled Themis. Explaining about them being suspects and defendants in murder cases, he asked, "Can you find a common denominator besides they were all murder suspects who got off?" He added, "I have no idea who Emma Wilkes is. David tried calling her number, but her phone had been turned off." Archie reminded him, "There were 2 murder victims in that room. How can you be so sure Stephen McGuire was the intended victim? What about Christine?" "The only one who'd want her dead is you," Max said. "Do you even want to go there?" She cocked her head at him. "Why would I want to kill Christine?" "So that you don't have to deal with an ex-wife on the scene," he replied. "You know how the security system works here at the inn. You probably even had a hand in setting it up. Don't tell me that if you didn't set your mind on it, you couldn't plan and execute a murder. You've been trained by the best." "You're the one who doesn't seem to have an alibi," she reminded him. "I have Gnarly," he said, "only he refuses to talk." They looked at each other over the tops of their glasses while enjoying another sip. "Do you really think I'm capable of killing someone?" A tremor slipped into her tone. He took her hands in his. "Only if you had to." He kissed her fingertips. Can I speak to you?" Mac jumped when he heard Ed Willingham's voice in his ear. It was so abrupt and harsh that he could feel the lawyer's spittle in his ear canal. The lawyer's face was inches from his own. His expression was so stern that Mac felt like a schoolboy caught cheating by the principal. In the far corner of the restaurant, he saw that Ed had been having a dinner meeting with Jeff Ingle. Mac had been so involved with Archie that he didn't notice them. "I need to talk to you over here." With his eyes and a toss of his head, the lawyer gestured for Mac to follow him over to the other table. "Please, Mr. Faraday." "Now?" "Now." After Archie nodded her consent for him to leave her alone at the table, Mac, puzzled by the sudden intrusion on what clearly had all the earmarks of a private dinner, got up and followed the attorney across the restaurant to where he'd been eating dinner with the inn's manager. Ed launched into the reason for the interruption as soon as Mac sat down. "What are you doing?" "I'm having dinner with Archie. It's been a tough week." "Dinner?" Ed's silver eyebrows seemed to reach halfway up to his receding hairline. She's dressed to die for. You're wearing a suit. You're drinking champagne. You've ordered a special dinner for just the two of you. You're kissing her fingers and look like you're about to start on her toes. Is this by any chance a date?" The guilt Mac had felt evaporated. Neither of us are married or otherwise engaged. "I don't know if you're aware of this, Mac, but Robin Spencer was world famous for coming up with imaginative ways of killing people," Ed said. "By virtue of that, so are you. Your ex-wife and her lover were killed in your resort. The police chief is your half-brother. Whether that's common knowledge or not, it's not hard to figure out. You don't know it yet, but you own Spencer, which was named after your ancestors who founded this town. Even though it's not true, it makes for a real sexy story that you had Christine and her lover killed, and your brother is covering it up to clear the way for you to begin a new relationship with a younger and notably much more beautiful woman." "That isn't what happened," Mac objected. "Doesn't matter," Jeff said. "It makes for a great story." "You know that isn't what happened, and I know it," Ed said. "I'm explaining that to conspiracy theorists, when they see you here at your five-star restaurant with your latest mistress—" "He's got a point, Mac," Jeff said. "It doesn't look good for you to be flashing Archie around in public so soon after these murders." Mac glanced over at Archie, who was gazing back at him. She seemed to sense what they were talking about. What would my mother have said to this? Ed looked over at Jeff. They both chuckled. "She'd tell me to go to hell," the lawyer finally replied. "But think about Archie, Mac. If the media saw you just now, how long do you think it would take for her to be tagged Mickey Forsythe's mistress?" "You make it sound like I was cheating on my wife," Mac said. "Archie and I have done nothing wrong. Didn't even meet her until after my divorce was final." Ed said, "I believe you. I'm glad for the both of you. I like Archie. Robin loved her like a daughter. It's the timing. Take her home with you. Make love to her day and night. Just keep your relationship behind closed doors till after these murders are solved." Jeff chimed in. "I've seen how the media and public react to these types of things. Do you really want to inflict that on Archie?" "She's the last one I want to get hurt." Mac could see her looking at him with question in her eyes as he made it back to their table. In his mind, he rehearsed how he was going to tell her that the relationship they'd been planning to take to the next level would now have to be taken there under wraps. He made it only halfway across the dining room before he turned back to the table of his lawyer and hotel manager. "Ed," Mac began, "you're without a doubt one of the best attorneys in the world, and I pay you a very hefty retainer for your advice. It's because you know what you're doing. And, Jeff, if it wasn't for you, the Spencer Inn wouldn't have kept its 5-star rating all these years. But you two have to understand, I have a problem." "Mac," Ed started to say. Mac held up his hand. "Ever since I can remember, people have been telling me I need to learn to do what I'm told. My adoptive parents, teachers, bosses, everyone. When I was a cop, officers I trained would get promoted over me, even though my record was way better than theirs. My supervisors would tell me that I would go far if I just do what I'm told to do." Ed and Jeff exchanged glances. "What I'm telling you, gentlemen, is that I respect your advice. You mean well. And one of the things I pay you for is the benefit of your vast experience in these types of matters. but I wouldn't do what I was told before I was rich and famous. I'm certainly not going to do it now." As they watched Mac return to join Archie at his private table, Jeff sighed. "Well, we tried." "I'm not surprised," Ed responded. "Between Robin Spencer and Patrick O'Callahan, Mac Faraday's gene pool has been dealt a double whammy of bullheadedness." "Problem?" Archie asked when he sat down next to her. "None." Aware of the waiter serving their salads, Mac didn't want to go into the matter any further. She brushed his cheek with her hand. "You're getting more like Mickey Forsythe every day, a man with a mind of his own." Hector came rushing into the lounge with his mini laptop under his arm. Seeing that the restaurant only had a few patrons, the security chief felt safe to raise his voice. "Mr. Faraday, I saw on the security monitor that you were here. We got something." Like a child bursting to tell about what he'd found, he sat in the seat next to Mac and opened up the laptop. Sensing a break in the case, Ed and Jeff rushed over to join them at the table. They all crowded around Hector in his chair to see the unveiling of the killer. "This is one bright bitch," Hector said with a note of awe, while opening up various screens on his small laptop. "I'm connecting this remotely to my computer in my office to show you what I found." Ed asked, "Why don't we all go over to your office?" "This will only take a minute," Hector answered. "Plus, it'll be easier with all of you. My office isn't that big." Archie explained. "Remote connection is so much easier than it used to be, especially with many laptops and all the other gadgets that are available. Just one click and you're working on your computer, which is someplace else. The speed and ease are virtually the same." On the monitor was a paused grayscale image of the corridor with a shot of the service elevator, the door to the stairwell, and down the hall at the end of the penthouse floor. The shot was too tight to capture the doors going into the suites. Since the cameras covered each end of the corridors and the only access on to and off the floor, none were necessary to cover the suites themselves. The key cards recorded the comings and goings of the suites. Hector set up the sequence for his audience. "Our problem has been figuring out who our killer was." "That's usually the problem with any murder mystery," Mac told him. Archie brushed against him when she moved her chair in closer to see the monitor. With a rebellious glance at Ed and Jeff, Mac slipped his arm around her. "You'd think it would be easy. Get her picture on the security video, blow it up, see if she has a record, get her name and address, and pick her up. But this bitch knows about the cameras. She won't look up for us to get her." Hector hit the play button. In less than a minute, the service elevator door opened. The server, a young man who Mac recognized as a service clerk who worked in the dining room, wheeled the cart off the elevator. A woman in a black house-cleaning smock held the elevator door open while he maneuvered the cart into the hall. "That's Nita." Hector placed his fingertips on the monitor at the woman in the black smock. At least that was the name she'd given to the other employees. Her bushy hair was tied back at her neck. Black plastic frame glasses covered her face. In her arms she carried a pile of white towels and a black bag hung from her shoulder. As Hector had pointed out, she never looked up or in any direction that the camera could capture a clear image of her face while she made her way down the corridor and out of the shot. He tapped the monitor with his fingertips while telling them over his shoulder, "Now it doesn't end there. You see, we have her getting onto the floor. Mike, the server, he said that she went to the suite across the hall from the murders. She was gone when he came out a few minutes later. The couple across the hall, the ambassador and his guest, said that she was delivering extra towels, which, when the police and I talked to them, they realized they hadn't ordered. Each one thought the other had ordered them. She tried talking to them in Spanish, which neither of them knew. She left. They heard her knocking on the door across the hall after she'd left their suite," Max said. "She was stalling until Mike was gone." Hector nodded his head. "Yeah, sure. And then she went into the suite across the hall. Christine had let her in. But the question remains, how did she get off the floor with security cameras at both ends of the hall? We never seen Nita leave." Jeff answered. "And you finally figured it out?" "Yep. Hector said. "Do we have anyone leave that floor that we don't see come on?" He grinned wickedly. "And we sure do. It was around 1:15 He switched the image on the monitor to another screen and sat back in his seat with his thumbs tucked into his belt. The image was that of the other end of the corridor at the guest elevator. A couple dressed for an evening came out into view. She had on a cocktail dress with high heels, while her companion wore a sports coat and slacks. The man pressed the call button for the elevator. When the door opened, they stepped on, and the man pressed the button inside the elevator. As the door started to shut, he grabbed the doors to stop them. A woman with long black hair, dressed in slacks, tunic top, and stylish chain belt, ran onto the car and jumped to the back out of camera view. The doors shut. Hector paused the video. That couple had spent the evening in the suite next door to the murders, the security chief said. 3 couples had booked the suite for the weekend. This couple had a cottage down on the lake. They came up for a party in the suite and had a temporary pass to get up to the penthouse floor. They said that when they left, well, you see it in the video. As soon as the doors opened, she flew faster than lightning out of your suite and into the elevator, out of shot. The man pressed the button for the lobby just like he did the call button, so she left no fingerprints. When she got to the lobby, she skipped out into oblivion. Max said, "But did you get a glimpse of her?" "Enough to know that nowhere in any of the videos do we have this woman arriving on that floor." Hector nodded his head quickly. "Just like we don't have Nita leaving. They have to be the same perp." "That's more than an hour after the murders," Max said. "That gives her plenty of time to clean up the murder scene and change from cleaning woman to hotel guest." He asked Hector, "Are you able to get a good picture of her leaving the inn, maybe in the lobby?" Hector shook his head. "She knew about the cameras, noticed that her head is down and turned away. Not only that, but she ran too fast for us to get anything. All I see is that she has long dark hair. I can make a guess about her height." Archie said, "She's wearing a wig, I can tell." "Of course it is," Max said, before ordering Hector, "Get these videos to Spencer Police as soon as you can. You did good work." "Lieutenant Faraday, I didn't see you there. Good to see you again." With the brandy in his hand, Judge Garrison Sutherland got up and trotted across the lobby from where he'd been enjoying the fireplace with Natasha Homestead to intercept Mac and Archie. The judge and lawyer were dressed casually in sweaters and slacks after having spent the evening out. At his urging, Mac and Archie joined them. Since the judge and Natasha filled the chairs, they had to sit next to each other on the love seat in front of the fireplace. Mac was uncomfortably aware of his lawyer's glare at him when he came into the lounge, to see that Mac had slipped his arm across her shoulders. After ordering 2 glasses of wine, Mac asked the judge, "Have you and Natasha extended your vacation?" Judge Sutherland replied, "We're still trying to find out what McGuire had to do with him here at the inn when he was killed. From what the police chief said, he'd packed light." Natasha asked, "Have you seen what he brought with him?" "No," Mac lied, "but the police chief did tell me that they found no pocket watch. I also talked to Jessica, my daughter. She's staying at Christine's house in Georgetown. You're more than welcome to contact her to make arrangements to meet her at the house to look through whatever is left of Stephen's belongings for this watch you're looking for. I suggest you do it soon, because as soon as I'm able to settle the estate, we're clearing everything out and I'm putting the house on the market." Garrison and Natasha exchanged glances. He chose to respond. "We'll do that right away, thank you." "I would have thought the McGuire family would have swooped in to demand answers by now." Mac asked Natasha, "Are they usually this laid back about murder in the family?" Her expression betrayed a great deal of puzzlement. "Granted, Stephen and I were married for a very short time, but they never chose to get involved in anything we did. No invitations to the Hamptons, not even a Christmas card. Stephen said that everyone was very busy, and that's why we never received any invitations to any of these family events you'd see on the social pages." Archie said, "That's not the way the media pictures them. According to them, the McGuires were close. They always throw big family weddings. We eloped, honey. McGuire funerals are massive." Mac said, "David told me that no one has even claimed McGuire's body." He cocked his head at Natasha. "You're his next of kin. Let a McGuire take care of burning him up or dumping him in the ground," she replied cruelly, while glaring over at him. For the first time, Mac noticed how thick her eyebrows were. "All I want is what belongs to me." "Nice young man, O'Callahan, Spencer's police chief." The judge took a sip of his drink. "I was surprised to see he was so young. But then I guess, considering the legend his father is around these parts, it would be expected that he'd step into his shoes." "From what I've learned about Patrick O'Callahan, they were big shoes to fill." Mac sipped his drink while Judge Sutherland watched him. "And David fills them very nicely," Archie said. "An interesting thing happened when Natasha and I met with him in the police station the other day," Garrison said to Mac. "Have you ever had one of those moments when you meet someone and they remind you of someone, but you can't put your finger on who it is they remind you of?" "Yes, I guess that's happened to everyone," Mac replied. "That happened when I met Chief David O'Callahan." Judge Sutherland peered at Mac with his dark eyes. They were intense as he studied him. The way he talked, his looks, especially around his eyes, I kept staring at him. It bothered me so much trying to figure out who it was he reminded me of that I couldn't even pay attention to most of our conversation. Mac felt him studying him. "It finally hit me when Natasha and I went to see you." After the server replaced his finished drink with a new one, the judge asked, "Have you ever found out the name of your birth father?" Unsure whether to lie or not, Mac peered back at him. He felt Archie's grip on his thigh. "There are websites all over the Internet with fans devoted to Robin Spencer and everything there is to know about her," the judge said. "Have you looked at them?" Mac said, "Actually, I haven't." The judge said, "Well, purely out of curiosity, I happened to Google your mother's name, and do you know how many websites came up?" "How many?" "Over 3.5 million websites. That's a lot of information out there about her." "Robin Spencer was a very popular author," Archie said. "Her books are in every language. She has fans all over the world." "Everyone loves Robin Spencer," the judge went on. "Now, these websites aren't all completely devoted to Robin Spencer and her life, but some are. And a lot of them do go into her life back when she was young, and do you know what they said?" Knowing the judge's style, Max sensed where he was leading, and he didn't like it. Neither did Archie, based on how tightly she had hold of his thigh. "According to her biography, back when she was a senior in high school, her parents sent her to a girls' finishing school up in New England. Knowing now, since her death, about you, everybody knows that in reality they sent her away to have you." Chuckling, Mac replied, "It's not exactly a secret anymore." The judge went on, "But then on one of those sites, long before it came out about you, there was a woman who posted that she had gone to high school with Robin Spencer. It was one of those posts about how talented and fun and outgoing and curious she was. This woman also remembered that for over a year Robin went steady with a certain boy who graduated the year ahead of them. This boy went on to police academy. She even remembered the name of the boy. Do you know what it was?" Mac and Archie glared at Judge Sutherland. The judge grinned at Mac. "I think you do." He pointed at Archie. "And she does, too." "What's your point, Your Honor?" Mac asked. "I also think David O'Callahan knows." He chuckled. "He's not stupid. All he had to do was to look at you. The family resemblance about slaps you in the face." "David has no problem with our relationship," Mac said. "We're friends." The judge's laughter was sarcastic. "Oh, I believe that. You two must be more than friends. I mean, Why else would he so quickly eliminate you as a suspect when your ex-wife and her lover got killed here in your private suite? There's no physical evidence to indicate that I was at the crime scene during the murders." Judge Sutherland said, "You know how the media works, Mac. The implication is so much more exciting than the truth." "So I've been told." Mac sat forward. "Your Honor, up until this moment I had immense respect for you. I've considered you to be one of the few fair and honorable lawyers on the face of this earth. What's happened to you?" "You can't possibly understand the importance of this whole issue," Natasha said. "I was a homicide detective for over 20 years. I know precisely the importance of all this." Mac asked, "What do you want that's so important to you that you would stoop to extortion, which I might add I'm not giving in to? David and I aren't broadcasting the identity of my father. True, but we're not keeping it a state secret either. Like you just said, it isn't hard to figure out. Before I forget about you being a judge and beat you about the head and shoulders, I want the truth about what you two want so badly from McGuire." Mac cocked an eyebrow at Natasha. "As a matter of fact, I just remembered that you know Spanish. I heard you use it when representing some Spanish clients. Our killer knew Spanish." "Spanish?" Natasha repeated. "She got onto the floor pretending to be a housekeeping woman by the name of Nita." Natasha glanced at the judge and blurted out the name, "Nita." Archie asked, "Do you know a Spanish-speaking woman named Nita who wanted to kill Stephen McGuire?" Natasha said, "I had a cleaning woman named Nita working for me a while back. She had some issues." "With Stephen McGuire?" Archie asked. Natasha replied, "Definitely with him. But then everyone had issues with Stephen." Mac told them, "There was a cleaning woman named Nita that worked for Christine's sisters who claimed McGuire raped her. Do you think that's possible?" Immediately Natasha nodded her head. "Certainly. He was a snake." "When she told someone about it, she was fired." Archie asked Natasha, "Does she still clean for you?" "No," Natasha said. "She disappeared. She quit, or maybe Stephen got her fired from her job. I lost contact with her. I mean, I suddenly wasn't able to get in contact with her. She had no phone. She'd been kicked out of her apartment. One day she was there, the next day she was gone." She looked over at Mac. "Do you think she killed Stephen? Or maybe you killed him and pretended to be Nita to throw us off your trail?" The judge raised his voice to pull Mac's attention from his companion. "Get any thought of Natasha killing McGuire out of your mind. She was with me at the Carmel Cove Inn during the murders." His affection for the defense attorney was obvious. Seeing that he would have to tread gently in order to keep his cooperation, Mac softened his tone. "Like you pointed out, I'm not without influence with the police chief. If I knew what you wanted so badly, I could help." The judge sucked in a deep breath that puffed out his barrel chest. He smoothed his hair and folded his hands in his lap. He looked hard at Mac for a long moment. He had given Mac that same look before in the courtroom when he was under cross-examination by defense attorneys, trying to twist the evidence in their client's favor. Mac would hesitate too long, and the judge would give him that glare before ordering him to dignify the attorney's inane question with an answer. "We told you what we want," the judge finally said. "I admit Natasha was foolish the way she went charging into the police station and demanding that O'Callahan turn everything over to her. I told her that. Then we thought that if we talked to you about it, you could have some influence with him. Instead, we've only made you suspicious, especially since you know now that we were in the area while McGuire was getting killed." Mac replied, "All I want is to clear my name and the inn's reputation. In order to do that, I need to know what's really going on. First, McGuire is poisoned at a party with both you and Natasha in attendance." "Half the lawyers in D.C. were there," the judge said, "most of whom would have loved to see McGuire dead." "But none of them were in Spencer the night McGuire was killed," Mac countered. The judge blinked. He shifted from one side of the chair to the other, like a horse pawing the ground, anxious to bolt. Gesturing at the two of them, Mac asked, "Does this have anything to do with your relationship, Your Honor?" The judge pointed out, "We've been together for a very long time." "Did your relationship begin during or after your marriage to McGuire?" Archie asked Natasha. "It began shortly after I married McGuire," the defense attorney confessed. "I knew almost immediately that I'd made a mistake marrying him." With a smirk on his face, the judge peered into his drink. "Natasha and I became involved after I made bench during a case that she had before me. Vance was the prosecutor. We knew it was inappropriate, and we kept it a secret because, if it ever came out—" He sighed. "You can't tell anyone. And if you do, I'll deny it, unless you find the recording." "Recording? What recording?" Mac asked. "We became involved during the Sid Baxter case," said Natasha. "It was my first major trial after being appointed judge, a child disappearance case." Judge Sutherland waited for Mac to recall. "Andy Sweeney, 9 years old. Disappeared on the same street where he lived while bike riding." Mac said, "Sid Baxter confessed. He threw it out." The lawyers' and judge's anger about the circumstances behind the suppressed confession was visible on their faces. Immediately Natasha raged. "Because Baxter asked repeatedly for his lawyer, and that idiot Lieutenant Fitzwater ignored it. I had to move to have his confession tossed. I had no choice." "And neither did I," Judge Sutherland joined in. "It broke my heart to let Baxter go, and it broke Natasha's to have any part in making it happen." Mac could see that it was their common misery that had brought them together. "McGuire began suspecting that we were involved during the Baxter case," the judge explained. "George Vance moved up to deputy not long after that, and Hunter started looking for his replacement. McGuire didn't have a lot of experience at that point, and his record wasn't much to write home about, but his family connections were appealing to Hunter. McGuire started recording Natasha's conversations with me in order to get something to hold over my head so that I'd put in a good word for him. It certainly wasn't out of romantic jealousy," Natasha jumped in. The judge confessed, "McGuire recorded us discussing Sid Baxter. Out of context, which is how we edited the recording, it sounds like I let Baxter off in exchange for sex, which isn't how it happened. We didn't become intimate until long after that case was over." Pleadingly, he reached over to grasp Mac's wrist. "Do you see what I mean?" "Your Honor, you do realize that McGuire holding something like that over you and Homestead gives you motive for wanting him dead. Killing him wouldn't do us any good as long as we don't know where the recording is." Judge Sutherland waved his hand in dismissal. "McGuire has been holding that recording over our heads for years. Since Vance has been appointed judge, it's been between McGuire and Roxanne Burton to take the deputy slot." Mac noted. "So you told me this morning." Natasha said, "Roxanne has seniority and a much better conviction record. Rightfully, the slot should go to her." Mac said, "But McGuire was a true blue blood, and his family connections could help Hunter get the Attorney General appointment, something Roxanne's family connections can't." "Exactly," the judge said. "McGuire wanted me to have a little talk with Hunter to help push him in the right direction. Hunter was torn, especially when McGuire blew the Garland case." Mac said, "I heard he was in the doghouse over that." The judge said, "But then Burton got slapped with an ethics charge in the Parker case. Did you hear about that?" Mac reminded the judge that he had been out of the loop for several months. "A bunch of juveniles stole computer equipment from their school and sold it to a fence that the older brother of one of the juvies used for his own B&E business. Burton's key witness, the fence, accused her of paying him $10,000 for his testimony against the juvies. Now, not only is she out of the running for the deputy slot," Natasha pointed out, "but now that McGuire's dead, I guess she's back in the running." "Not if she's disbarred," the judge countered, "which could happen." Max said, I guess it makes it two of them even. Garrison nodded his head. I wouldn't be surprised if McGuire made it that way. He got the fence to lie, Max said with certainty. It sounded so much like Stephen McGuire. I'd believe that before I believed that Burton paid him to testify, the judge said. The fence came in with an envelope full of money. Someone paid him for something. I doubt that it's just a coincidence that this accusation came up right after the Garland incident, he scoffed. Word around the courthouse was that Roxanne set McGuire up, hoping that it would blow his chances for the promotion, and he made things even. The problem is that the ethics committee, which happens to be made up of a lot of McGuire's friends, isn't letting this accusation drop. They're doing a full investigation into the charge, and Burton may end up being disbarred. Mac wondered, do you think she set him up? Garland's attorney belongs to some of the same committees as Sabrina, Roxanne's sister, the judge said. Mac said, knowing that family, I wouldn't be surprised if it was Sabrina who set him up, and Roxanne knew nothing about it. Natasha said, rightfully, the deputy slot should have gone to Roxanne. If Hunter was torn, it wasn't very much. The backing of McGuire's family for the attorney general slot was too tempting. The judge groaned. I hated myself for going to bat for McGuire. And him making you do it, Mac pointed out. Natasha said, we never entertained the thought of killing him. Someone did poison him at that party, Mac said. Natasha held up her hands with her fingers spread. I can count on both hands other people at the party who wanted him dead, including Christine, who was staying at your inn when he was killed. Wasn't her death an accident? I heard she was drunk and fell and hit her head. Someone else was there, Mac said. What kind of scandal was McGuire looking to uncover? That I don't know, the judge said. Of course, if that tape was found and made public, both Natasha's and my careers would be over for letting the pedophile back out on the streets. So you see why it's so important that we get it. Seeing the weight they were under, Mac sighed. I see. The judge asked, did O'Callahan find it? Mac shook his head. He did find a folder labeled Themis. You know what that is? While Judge Sutherland's face was blank, Mac did notice him sit up taller. Natasha gazed over at her companion. She put on her best poker face. He'd seen that expression in court hundreds of times. It gave nothing away. I'm sorry, the judge replied after a moment. What was that name again? Themis. No first name or initial. Could have some connection with Dillon Booth. Who? Dillon Booth. Homicide victim. I was the lead detective in the case and went cold. What makes you think this particular victim is connected with this Themis? Before Mac could answer, the judge glanced at his wristwatch. I'm sorry, Mac, but we have to get going. We forgot that we have an appointment. After walking hand in hand casually out of the lounge, they both broke into a trot once they reached the lobby. Watching them hurry away, Mac asked, Do they look guilty to you? Archie replied, They look guiltier than we do. Chapter 10. Now you have me so excited that I'm speeding, Mac told Archie, when he saw the Spencer police cruiser come up behind his sports car and turn on its lights. A glance at the speedometer showed that it had been going 42 miles an hour on the twisting mountain road in a 35-mile-an-hour zone in his hurry to take Archie back to Spencer Manor to enjoy their strawberries dipped in chocolate. He pulled over to the side of the road. She laughed when she saw him reaching for his registration in the glove compartment. That's David. He's not going to give you a ticket. Before Mac could reply, the police chief knocked on his driver's side window. Hey, don't you ever answer your cell? Was I speeding? A little, David replied. You should watch that. I'd hate to give you a ticket. We got a call from the Morgantown police. They picked up Cameron Jones for possession, and she's singing like a canary about Stephen McGuire's murder. Plus, one of my officers ID'd the woman from the security video who McGuire was having dinner with on Saturday. Her name was Bonnie Propst. She's the president of Propst Security. The inn has bought some security equipment from her company." "Did the dinner McGuire was having with Propst look like a date?" Mac wondered if she was the one whose vaginal fluid had been found on McGuire's bedsheets. "I don't think so. The tapes aren't the best, but I didn't see any lovey-dovey eyes," David added. "Not only that, but I noticed something else in the security video. Remember that couple I told you about that came into my office demanding McGuire's personal belongings, his wife and the judge?" His last discussion with Judge Sutherland, fresh on his mind, Mac replied, "I certainly remember them." "Guess who was having dinner within camera range of McGuire?" David said. "According to Ingle, they even had reservations for that evening. They were sitting 3 tables away from him while he was eating his last meal." "They failed to mention that." Mac turned to Archie. "Do you recall them saying anything about that to you, dear?" "Never said anything like that to me, darling," David continued. "Anyway, I'm going out to Morgantown to question Cameron Jones and wanted to know if you wanted to tag along as my consultant. I've been calling you on your cell." Noticing her dress and his suit, David stopped. "I'm sorry. Were you on your way to get your back scratched?" Mac glanced over at Archie. He was torn. He so wanted to be with her, but he was also anxious to get answers about what Stephen McGuire was doing in Spencer. If he declined David's invitation, he'd have to wait until at least the next day to drag it out of him. She grasped his wrist. "For that, you have to let me come along, too." "I wasn't planning on this turning into a field trip," David said, while holding the back door to his cruiser open for Gnarly to jump into what had become his seat directly behind the driver. While Mac and Archie were changing into more comfortable jeans and sweaters, Gnarly had spied David's cruiser and saw that his family was going on an outing. According to Archie, he insisted on being included. The next stop on the way to the Morgantown station was a diner across the state line in West Virginia, off Route 68, where David, who hadn't eaten dinner yet, knew the food was good and the service fast. Archie and Mac drank coffee while David ordered 2 cheeseburgers and fries. One of the burgers was plain and to-go for the German Shepherd cooling his jets in the cruiser in the parking lot. It was a far cry from the elegant dinner Mac and Archie had had at the inn, but a good opportunity to go over what they had so far in their investigation and come up with a plan on which direction to go from there. While waiting for David's dinner, Mac recalled, "Did you say that the woman that McGuire was having dinner with on Saturday was Bonnie Propst, and she owned a security company in Morgantown?" After David confirmed that it was, he pointed out that there was a Douglas Propst on the list found in the Themis folder. "Archie, can you look it up on your phone and find out if there's any connection between Bonnie and Douglas Propst?" Mac was glad to see that she had already pulled out her smartphone and was searching the internet. There was no file labeled Propst in the Themis folder. David eyed a plate of delicious-smelling food passing their booth, but not coming his way. "What do you know about Douglas Propst?" I had been in homicide only a couple of years when it happened," Mac recalled. "Douglas Propst was a uniformed officer and a bully. He was the type of cop that gave us a bad name. Charged with brutality a couple of times. Really nasty bastard. One day his wife disappeared. His story was that she left him a note saying she was going out for milk while he was out for a run. After her body turned up with a broken neck and his skin under her fingernails, family and friends started making statements about spousal abuse. His name was moved up to the top of the suspect list real fast." When the server arrived with his tray of food, Mac could see that it took all of David's restraint to not grab the plate and devour his burger like a barbarian. It made him wonder if David had eaten since the donut he'd had earlier that day. "I think I remember that case. I was like 15 when that happened." David smiled his gratitude at the buxom server when she refilled his cup along with the others at the table. Mac had noticed that David greeted her by her first name when they had come in. The grease on the burger and the soggy fries made him wonder if it was the service that David enjoyed as much as the food. "If I remember correctly, Probst was arrested?" David asked after the server left. Mac nodded his head somberly. "And tried, twice. Both times it ended up in a hung jury." "Did he do it?" "Everybody knew he did it," Mac shrugged. "Wasn't my case. I was in homicide at the time, but not close to the investigation. I remember it was one of those cases where everyone knew he did it, but there was no real evidence." "Except his skin under her fingernails," David said. Natasha Homestead was his attorney. "This case made her career." "I didn't actually meet her until the Keating case," Mac said. "Homestead argued that since they were married, the skin had gotten under her fingernails during marital relations." David shot Archie a naughty look. "I never had that actually happen." "I saw that," Archie said, with her eyes still on her smartphone. "I could say a few things about you, Dave." Mac steered them back to the topic of Douglas Probst. No other evidence could be found to use against him. "What about the abuse?" David wanted to know. Mac said, "Not once had the police been called to their home for domestic disturbance. Once she'd gone to the ER with a broken wrist. She said it was because she'd fallen off a stepladder. Some friends had seen her with a black eye. She said it was an accident. The Probsts had argued in public, but he was never seen hitting her." Mac grimaced. "Probst was a bully and abusive in the field. All that was kept from the jury. Homestead pointed out how many couples have fights in public, but the wife doesn't end up dead." He shrugged. "Both times the jury got hung. The prosecutor finally said that until we got more evidence, they weren't wasting their time." "Who was the prosecutor?" David popped a fry into his mouth. "McGuire?" "That was before McGuire's time at the attorney's office," Mac said. "Garrison Sutherland was the prosecutor on the Probst case." "The judge that Homestead is sleeping with now." David chewed a big bite of his burger and frowned at the same time. "Douglas Probst is Bonnie Probst's late husband." Archie held up the phone for them to see the screen. "Late, as in dead?" Mac asked. She went on to read the screen. "Douglas Probst was a retired cop. He opened Probst Security in Morgantown, West Virginia, with the money from his late wife's life insurance. 2 years later, he was killed when he walked in on a burglary in his office. Since then, his widow, Bonnie Probst, has made the company one of the most successful security firms in the tri-state area, according to the company bio." Mac scratched his head. "Douglas Probst is dead." "If the perp is dead, then it would make no sense for McGuire to reopen the case." David finished the last bite of his burger. Archie slipped her phone into her purse. "Unless he had found new evidence while working on this Themis case that Probst didn't kill his wife." Mac took out his wallet to pay for the bill. "I guess we'll find out when we talk to his widow." First they had to go to the Morgantown police station, where Cameron Jones, the college dropout claiming to be Stephen McGuire's illegitimate daughter, was spending the night in a holding cell, awaiting a bond hearing on possession of crack cocaine with intent to distribute. In the station's reception area, David, Mac, and Archie met Master Sergeant Rick Bromberg, the trooper who'd arrested Cameron. The tall, muscular, bald-headed officer shook David's hand so hard that he shook the police chief's whole arm. "David O'Callahan, nice to see you. Congratulations on the appointment to chief. I always thought if anyone should take over your dad's slot, it should be you." While shaking his hand, Sergeant Bromberg glanced down the corridor to the holding cells. "We're taking Jones into an interview room now. Like I told you on the phone, we busted her for possession with intent to distribute, and she immediately started talking about wanting to make a deal. We put out an APB on her as a suspect and witness in the McGuire murder this afternoon," David told him. "It must have been about the same time that we busted her." The sergeant looked worried. "We're hoping she'll roll over on her boyfriend, who is a person of interest in the drug community here in Morgantown. Instead, she wants to roll on the murder in your neck of the woods." He confessed, "I really don't want to give her up with what we have against her. This is the best break we've had in nailing the boyfriend." David cocked his head at Mac and Archie. "Why don't you let me hear what she has to say first?" Mac and Archie watched from the observation room, while David went into the interrogation room, where Cameron Jones sat at the table. Mac's memory of their brief meeting days before was unclear. At the time, he'd been focused on calming Christine down. After learning that she was trying to con Stephen McGuire out of money, Mac's perception of her created the image of a hard young woman willing to say and do whatever it took to keep up her party lifestyle. That image was a far cry from the little girl shivering in her thin, sleeveless top over a short skirt with only sandals to cover her bare feet in the cold interrogation room this late in the night. She looked like a frightened animal. "What do you think?" Mac asked Archie, while comparing Cameron to the woman running onto the guest elevator in the security video. "She could be the right height and build," Archie answered, "but would she know enough about how security works at the inn?" "If she's involved with drug dealers, she knows enough about security, period." "Cameron, I'm David O'Callahan, the police chief in Spencer, Maryland. Tell me what you know about Stephen McGuire." Taking on a casual attitude to put her at ease, David straddled the back of the chair across from her. He'd laid his pen on top of the notepad in the middle of the table. "I want a deal," she said forcibly. After all his years of experience dealing with suspects from all walks of life and criminal experience, Mac saw that her harsh demand for a deal was a cover for her fear. David said, "You don't seem very broken up about his murder. That's surprising, since you claim Stephen McGuire was your father." That was all a misunderstanding," she said. "I didn't kill him, but I can tell you who did. All I want is a deal." "I already know you weren't on the scene," David said. "My sources tell me that you have an airtight alibi. That makes me wonder how you would know who did it." "Because I saw her try to kill him before." "Are you talking about the woman who attacked you in the lobby?" She sat back in her seat. "I'm not telling you any more until I have a deal." David started to rise out of the chair. "I can see I'm wasting both our time. I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood. I thought you had some useful information on this case." "Wait." She jumped out of her seat and grabbed his arm. "I saw her try to kill him the day before. I can identify her. All I need is for you to give me a deal." "I don't help drug dealers." "I'm not a dealer. My boyfriend's the dealer. I don't even use drugs. When I don't help him, he beats me up. I had no choice. But I told him about my friend Rebecca from school and her daddy, and it was all his idea that I contact this McGuire guy and get him to pay me off to go away." Clinging to David's arm, she pleaded, "Please, you have to help me. Please, don't let them send me to jail." "He's going to sit back down," Archie whispered. David lowered himself back down into the chair. "Told you," she grinned. "David's always had a soft spot for the ladies, especially if she's a lady in distress." David told her, "First off, Morgantown is out of my jurisdiction. The only thing I can do is put in a good word with the prosecutor here. If you cooperate with me and the police here about your boyfriend's drug activities, then they'll be more inclined to help you than not." Without a reply, she stared at the two-way mirror while seeming to consider his advice. After they sat a long time in silence, David said to her, "What do you know about what Stephen McGuire was doing in Spencer?" "Nothing," she answered. "He said he had some business in the area. On Friday we met at some restaurant on the lake. It was closed for renovations. There was a big pool table on the lower level. It was really cool. He was really cool. He had gotten some burgers from the takeout place on the corner. We played pool, we even had some beer. Then I made my move. I told him about flunking out of school, but now I was getting my act together and wanted to make a new start. But since things were so tough that I needed some money, or I would follow him back to D.C. and meet all his friends." She stopped. David urged her to continue. To which McGuire replied, He said he'd have to think about it and wanted to get together for drinks at the Spencer Inn the next day to discuss it. Then what? David urged her to continue. She asked, "Are you talking about at the place with the pool table on the lake or the Spencer Inn? The place where you saw some woman trying to kill him the day before he ended up dead?" "Yeah, right," she said, "at the lake. After he put me off about giving me any money, I had to go take a leak. I was in the bathroom and I heard this big fight. It was like wild. I went back downstairs and there was this crazy woman there and she was screaming like a witch at McGuire. I couldn't believe he was laughing at her." "What was she screaming about?" "She called him a liar and he laughed even more. That pushed her off the deep end and this bitch grabbed a screwdriver and went at him with it." David sat up straight. "A screwdriver? I don't think she's talking about the drink," Archie said. Cameron continued. "McGuire took it off her and slapped her down. She took off running out of there." David frowned. "Did McGuire tell you who she was?" She shook her head. "He didn't give me a name. He just said that she was some crazy bitch who couldn't take a joke. But I saw her. I could identify her if I saw her in a lineup." "What did she look like?" David leaned in toward her. In the observation room, Mac and Archie pressed up against the glass. "She had long black hair." "Mac, I hate to tell you this, but Christine had been in Spencer at least 2 days before Stephen McGuire got killed." David glanced over his shoulder to the back of the cruiser, where Mac was sitting in the back seat behind Archie. Except for the occasional squawks over the radio, the inside of the cruiser had been so quiet since they'd left the police station to find their way to Bonnie Prop's condo complex that all they could hear was Gnarly breathing in the seat next to Mac. Little had he envisioned his romantic evening with Archie would end up with him in the back seat with a 100-pound German shepherd with bad breath. "I checked with the security cams at the main intersection in McHenry, coming in and out of Spencer," David said. "We have her car on Route 219 Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Roxanne Burton stated that Christine had told her that she was coming out to the lake house to clear her head." David continued gently. "I'm beginning to think that maybe she did kill McGuire. We don't have any actual evidence to prove she didn't do it. The clone phone with her fingerprints on it was in her suitcase. This other person that was on the scene could be a witness to the murder. Afterwards, they got into a fight. Christine fell, hit her head, and died. The witness panicked, cleaned up the scene, and ran. Even before her illness, Christine wasn't clever enough to have thought up anything like McGuire's murder," Mac said. "It was planned. The wig and smock and getting up to the suite by way of the service elevator. Christine has been out of her mind ever since she took up with McGuire. That's what made her such a good target for a snake like him. No way she could have planned it well enough to have pulled any part of it off." Their silence made him turn to the only one he could turn to. "What do you think, Gnarly?" He stroked the dog's back. Gnarly answered with a tongue that went into Mac's ear. Bonnie Propst lived in a high-rise condominium on a hill overlooking West Virginia University's campus. Her condo was on the 8th floor of a 12-story building. Late in the evening, they were lucky that many of the residents were coming and going. Most of them looked like academic types from the university. With the coming and going, it was easy for David in his police chief uniform to get a resident on the way out to hold the door of the main entrance open to allow them, with Archie leading Gnarly on his leash, into the lobby of the secure building. "The same way Nita got up to the penthouse floor," Mac noted. David checked his notes. "Bonnie Propst lives in Unit 812. On their way up to the 8th floor, Archie petted Gnarly, who sat obediently for her in the back of the elevator. His ears were up in attention. "I think Gnarly likes police work." "He's not on the payroll," David cracked. "He was trained in the United States Army," Archie reminded them. "He also got a dishonorable discharge for what, we don't know," Mac said. They found apartment 812 to be a corner unit. After answering the door on the first knock, Bonnie Propst looked displeased when she saw David flash his badge and identify himself as the police chief investigating the murder of Stephen McGuire in Spencer, Maryland. Blocking the entrance into her condo with her door, she stated, "If you have any questions about Stephen McGuire's murder, you'll need to talk to my lawyer." She reached behind her to snatch a business card from a table and thrust it into David's hand. While David tried to negotiate for some information, Gnarly looked up and down the hallway like a censor on duty. Having met Douglas Propst, Mac remembered him as a vain, antagonistic man who hated not having control, especially over his women. Bonnie Propst was overweight, something her late husband would have abhorred. In spite of her weight, she had a pretty face. Her clothes and makeup were tastefully applied, and she was stylishly dressed in a business suit. "Stephen McGuire is dead," David said. "He was killed after having dinner with you. If there's anything that you can think of—" "It wasn't a date," she said. "That was the first time I had ever met him." Mac interjected. "If it wasn't a date, what was it?" "Business," she said quickly. "I own a security company. He was opening a business in Spencer and wanted to know about our services. It's important to have a good security service, especially for a restaurant on the lake." "Do you always meet potential clients at five-star restaurants on Saturday night?" Mac asked. "He set it up," she answered. "I don't get invited to the Spencer Inn very often." Who was I to argue? Mac and David exchanged glances. Mac chose to toss out the next question. "Did Stephen McGuire mention your late husband during the interview?" "No," she answered too quickly. "Stephen McGuire was the prosecutor in D.C. where your late husband was tried twice for killing his first wife," Mac said. "Maybe he had some questions about what your husband may have told you about his wife's murder or the trials." "He's dead, long gone," she responded in a firm tone. "Look, I'm sorry Mr. McGuire is dead, but my dead and forgotten husband doesn't have anything to do with it." She tried to slam the door shut, but found the police chief's foot in the way. David explained, "Since you work in security and with the police, you have to understand that since you were the last person to see Stephen McGuire alive, we need to know what took place when you met him. What did you talk about? Did anything happen? Did anyone come to the table to talk to him?" She hissed at him. "Surveillance cameras, motion detectors, police and fire alarms. That's all we talked about. As for what we did, we met at the Spencer Inn for dinner at 7 o'clock. I ate shrimp scampi over linguine. He ate the filet mignon. He paid for dinner. I came home. That's all that happened." After kicking David in the shin to get him to remove his foot, she slammed the door shut. David turned to Mac, who was petting Gnarly. "What do you think?" "I think the woman doth protest too much." Gnarly exploded into a round of snarling barks. Archie held onto his collar while he lunged at the elevators. The woman in the car jumped back from the 100 pounds of fur and teeth, straining against the collar holding him back from getting at her. Keeping her eye on the dog, she moved slowly to get off the elevator. Mac noticed that, at first glance, she appeared much younger than her true age. The red curly hair that fell to her shoulders and her athletic figure made him think that she was more youthful than the hardness in her face revealed. This woman has had a hard life. "Sorry," Archie gasped at her. "I guess he doesn't like your perfume." "What's gotten into him?" Mac joined her in grasping his collar. David muttered, "I knew we should have left him in the car." The red-haired woman backed up against the wall to get as far away as she could from Gnarly, who continued to strain to get at least one tooth into her, while Mac and Archie dragged him onto the elevator. Her glare said that she was unforgiving of the dog's anger. "What's up with him?" David whirled around to glare at the dog once the doors were shut. Archie suggested, "Maybe she had a particular nice dog biscuit in her pocket that he wanted to steal." "I thought it was a B&E type of dog," Mac said, "not a armed robbery sort." Whining, Gnarly pawed at her. "He didn't like her," she explained. "Not everybody likes everyone." Just because he doesn't like someone, he doesn't have to rip their throat out, David said. Once they stepped outside into the parking lot, Gnarly exploded again into a fit of snarling barks. He lunged on his leash with such force, trying to charge across the parking lot, that Mac had to grab the end of the leash from Archie in order to drag the dog in the other direction to the cruiser. "Gnarly has lost his mind," David told Archie, as she climbed into the front seat, while Mac played a tug-of-war with the dog to get him into the back. "I can't take him with me any more. He's too unpredictable." "He was fine until he ran into that woman that came out of the elevator," Archie said. "Gnarly has a good sense of people. Maybe she's a bad person." "And maybe he's nuts." David fastened his seat belt and turned on the engine. "He's stolen from all your neighbors and has started shoplifting from the stores on the other side of the lake, damn it." They waited for Mac, who had to lift Gnarly up to set him in the back seat. "I don't know what's gotten into him." He climbed in next to the dog and closed the door. "Something's gotten under his skin." David put the cruiser into reverse. Suddenly, Gnarly was in Mac's lap, barking and snarling. Gnarly pressed his nose against the window. With the dog blocking David's view in the mirror, he pressed his foot on the brake. "Mac, do something about him. I can't see." "What are you so upset about?" Mac looked through the window to determine what Gnarly wanted so badly. They were looking at a parking lot. It was only half filled with a variety of vehicles. Recalling that Gnarly was trying to get to the other side, Mac peered in the direction that the dog had tried to drag him. On the other side of the parking lot, far away from the main entrance, where the lighting wasn't as bright, there was only one vehicle parked in the last space next to the rear exit, which provided easy access to the side roads out of town. It was a black Ford SUV. Where did I see a black Ford SUV? "Mac, do something about Gnarly," David was saying. "I can't see to pull out." "Wait." Mac pressed his index finger against the glass. "I think Gnarly is trying—" The police cruiser jarred with the impact of a blow from overhead. Archie screamed. Mac would later recall thinking he'd never realized she was capable of reaching such high notes. David whirled around to see what had shattered the windshield. He only caught a split-second glimpse of it before the front airbags exploded. The shock caused him to hit the gas pedal, which shot the cruiser backward, straight into the path of a van, carrying a group of senior citizens. With no time to stop, the van plowed into the cruiser's driver's side, which set off the side airbags. Gnarly, who seemed to be as stunned as everyone else, held Mac pinned against his seat while he cried into his ear. "Gnarly," Mac moaned while patting the top of his head, "you're a good dog, but I'm going to kill you." The inside of the cruiser seemed to take on the atmosphere of an electrified nightclub, with the lights flashing and the sirens going off. The police operator's voice called out from the radio to confirm notice that the cruiser had been in a collision and needed emergency response. In Mac's aching head, she sounded like she was calling from another planet. After David confirmed that they had indeed been in an accident, she asked, "What did you collide with?" "A dead body." Chapter 11. Smirking faces flashed before Mac in his dreams. Freddie Gibbons, Jr., sneering during Mac's interrogation about the 7 innocent women he had raped in Rock Creek Park. Each attack escalated in violence. He won the status of killer after strangling his last victim. He taunted the detective. "Yeah, I did it. What are you going to do about it?" Then there was Leo Samuels. The gold and diamonds he wore on every part of his body cost more than the house Mac would later lose to his wife. All had been paid for with blood money collected from his business of drugs and prostitution. The day Samuel strutted out of the courthouse after Mac's evidence against him had been tossed out, the gang leader made a point of plowing into the detective. "Later, sucker." His breath felt hot against Mac's face. For an instant, Mac wanted to press his gun against Samuel's stomach and pull the trigger. He wanted to give his victims the justice denied to them by the system, the same type of justice that someone had given Sid Baxter. "There's the bastard," Mac's partner cursed. He started out of a sleepy trance he'd fallen into while staring at a spot on the lid of his coffee cup to gaze across the street to where the creature posing as a human being going by in the name of Sid Baxter had climbed out of his car. He was clutching an armload of what appeared to be mail to his chest. A plain brown envelope was tucked under his arm. At the back door of his house in the lower middle-class neighborhood, Sid Baxter looked around while digging in his pockets for his keys. Mac put the binoculars to his eyes to close on Baxter's face. He looks worried. He should be. Detective Paul Grove was Mac's senior partner. During his long police career, Detective Grove had seen it all. Some detectives grow from what they see. Others become bitter, like Grove. "I still can't believe they let that bastard back out on the streets," he muttered. He won't be for long," Mac said. "We'll get him." Sid's dark little eyes darted around till he saw Mac watching from the sedan across the street. Spotting him, Sid clutched the package tighter to his body and hurried inside. "He spotted us," Mac told his partner. "So what?" They made no move to conceal themselves. They didn't have to. Since Sid Baxter had been released after confessing to killing 8-year-old Andy Sweeney, the prosecutor and police chief had ordered 2 units to keep the pedophile and child killer under constant surveillance till they could find some way to get him behind bars. He actually confessed, damn it! Detective Grove wasn't alone in his anger. The detectives in homicide were outraged that Judge Garrison Sutherland had tossed out Sid Baxter's confession and released him. It wasn't expected of a judge who'd been so passionate about justice when he was a prosecutor. After 4 nights of listening to Detective Grove's complaining about the justice system and tailing a man who did nothing at night except watch television, Mac snapped. "If you want to blame anyone for releasing the likes of Sid Baxter out onto the streets, blame Fitzwater. He's the one who blew it, not Sutherland. Fitzwater." Grove argued. "Listen, I know you and Fitzwater don't get along, but he did his job. He found out who snatched the kid. He got a confession, damn it, and the court let him go. Fitzwater did what he needed to do." Mac resumed staring at the small house tucked toward the back of the bare lot, to leave only a small backyard. While the other homeowners did what they could to make their cozy places as inviting as possible, Baxter did nothing. There were no shrubs or trees. The backyard was confined behind a chain-link fence. "You're aware that Andy Sweeney was about the same age as Tristan." Grove aimed for Mac's vulnerable spot. "If it was your son, you wouldn't be sitting here making excuses for Sutherland letting Baxter go. Baxter'd be dead already." "No, it would be Fitzwater that'd be dead for screwing up the whole investigation and sending us all back to square one." Detective Grove was right. Detective Fitzwater and Mac had mixed like oil and vinegar ever since Mac got promoted to the homicide division right out of uniform, an unusual appointment for a detective so young. Fitzwater didn't like the young officer. He was openly insulting and more than once hurried to their lieutenant to take credit for Mac's theories on cases. Mac could see Sid Baxter going through the mail at his kitchen counter. "Have you ever watched National Geographic?" Mac asked his partner. "What?" Detective Grove's doughy face screwed up at the notion of wasting his time watching anything so educational. "Nature shows?" "Tristan's into science." Mac didn't want to confess that the shows captured his interest as well. "Anyway, on these shows, when a pack of wolves goes chasing after a jackrabbit, if the rabbit's lucky, he can jump into a hole where the wolves can't reach him. When that happens, the wolves have a couple of options. Some wolves waste their time banging their heads trying to get the rabbit by following the path it took to hide. The smart ones will look around and find another way to get to it. Some will even double back around and come up behind the rabbit to snag it from behind." Mac took his eyes off Sid Baxter to glance back at Grove. "I don't like to waste my time banging my head against a rock, trying to get into a hole I can't fit into, or coercing confessions that aren't going to be worth the paper they're written on. I'd rather spend my time doing something worthwhile, like doubling back and finding another way in to nail my suspects, ways that are going to stick. Mac turned back to watch Sid Baxter at his kitchen window. With excitement that resembled a child on Christmas morning, he unwrapped the package, sealed in plain brown paper. And what about when those legal weenies at the courthouse decide to block that way in because it's infringing on some poor pervert's rights? Grove asked in a mocking tone. Frankly, to tell you the truth, if that Sweeney boy's dad came over here right now with a shotgun to blow Baxter away, I wouldn't be inclined to stop him. Mac brought his binoculars to his face to watch their suspect more closely. Baxter got something in the mail. What? With his eyes glued to the glasses, Mac caught sight of the object clasped in Sid Baxter's hand when he stuck a cigarette between his lips. And it looks like a tape. He felt his blood rise. Must be a sex tape. Child pornography. Mac adjusted the focus on the binoculars to get a closer image of the tape before Sid Baxter left the room to go view it in the living room. He didn't want to leave the warmth of the car to crawl into the bushes on the other side of the house to look in the window. His grin broadening in what had to be anticipation, Sid Baxter brought the lighter up to the end of his cigarette and flicked the end. Still hearing the roar of the bomb that blew Sid Baxter to pieces, Mac sprang up on the gurney. David was on the other gurney, flirting with the nurse bandaging his shoulder. Hearing Mac's cry, she whirled around to ease him into lying back down onto the gurney. "It's okay, Mr. Faraday. You're all right. You're in the hospital. You suffered a blow to the head. You need to rest." Mac laid his head back down on the pillow and floated back to the boat dock off Spencer Manor. Spencer, Maryland, had been founded by Mac's ancestors and was populated with residents who make up the listing of who's who. Mac's neighbors were rich and famous, like Andrew Keating had been. His life had been one of fame, luxury, and achievement, until Jillian Keating ended it. Once again Mac found himself outside the courthouse, while Jillian Keating swam through the sea of journalists with Natasha Homestead at her side. Wrapped in her fur coat, she flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and smiled for the cameras, all her glory, after getting off for killing her husband. She slowed her pace when she saw Mac, the cop who had captured her. A brilliant smile crossed her face. Her driver opened the back door of her limousine. Before getting in, she paused to look Mac in the face. With a wink, she puckered her red lips and blew him a kiss. Without a word, she climbed into the back of the limousine and sailed away. As the car faded from sight, Mac turned away to see the killer's defense attorney, Natasha Homestead. Her smile of triumph matched that of her client. "How can you even look yourself in the mirror?" Mac's grip cutting into the flesh on her arms turned her triumph into fear. Judge Garrison Sutherland appeared at his side. "Let her go, Mac." "He was a lonely old man, and she used him," Mac hissed at her. "Jillian made him fall in love with her, and then she killed him. For what? His money? He thought she loved him, and she killed him." "Let her go," Garrison ordered the detective. "Parasites and monsters," Mac fumed. "That's who you work for. Parasites and monsters. How can you look at yourself in the mirror, twisting the system around the way you do to let them back out on the street?" "Detective?" Garrison snapped the title like a whip. It was the only time Mac saw fear in Natasha Homestead's face. His grip on her arm seemed to shut off the usual strong-willed demeanor that had become her trademark. "We're the ones who have to clean up the mess your clients make after you open the door to let them back out on the street. Mac!" He felt a firm grip on his shoulder. "Mac, wake up!" David's voice broke through his dreams. Mac opened his eyes. The white ceiling above him and the call for a doctor in the corridor outside his room reminded him of where he was. He sprung up in his bed. He remembered Archie's screams. "Archie?" "It's okay, Mac. Everything is okay." David pressed him back down on his shoulder. "We're at WVU Hospital. You hit your head. You're going to be okay." Feeling his forehead, Mac could feel the puffy bruise over his right eye. As his vision cleared, he saw that David's left arm was in a sling. "You?" "It's only a dislocated shoulder. Hurts like hell, but I walked away. Not bad for getting hit in the driver's side door by a van. Airbags did their job. Archie walked away without a scratch. She'll be having nightmares about a woman landing on her face right in front of her, but other than that..." The more Mac woke up, the more his head hurt. "What happened to me?" He was surprised by David's laughter. "Your airbag went off like it was supposed to. Luckily, the impact was perfectly cushioned by Gnarly's head. You got head-butted by a dog." "Gnarly, I'm gonna kill you." The pounding lessened when he laid back to rest his head on the pillow. It didn't feel much better for him. He was staggering around after the emergency crew got him out of the cruiser. "Where is he now?" Mac wanted to know. "Bogey's driving them home. Archie and I have given our statements to the police about last night. They'll be wanting to talk to you." Now it was coming back to him. Gnarly's barking, his attempt at attacking the redhead in the elevator, her deadly eyes, the black Ford SUV. Mac grabbed David's wrist. "I remember now what got under Gnarly's fur. It was the black Ford." "What black Ford?" "SUV parked on the other side of the parking lot." Mac was clinging to David's good arm and shirt. "It was the same black Ford SUV that the shooter escaped in after shooting at us at Nancy Brenner's house. I recognized it. Gnarly must have recognized the scent. And that woman who got off on the elevator, it had to have been her. Someone threw Bonnie Propst off her balcony." David pried Mac's fingers off from where they were digging into his arm. "The police told me that her place was wrecked. She put up quite a fight before going over the balcony railing. It was the same person who was shooting at us. She didn't want Bonnie Propst talking to us." David said. "She has to be Nita." Mac agreed. "If she went after Bonnie Propst because her late husband's name was on that list, then his murder has to be connected to Themis, whatever that is." They were on their way back to Spencer in the back of a state police cruiser when the state forensics lab emailed to David's phone their report on fingerprints found in Stephen McGuire's suite. "Her name is Justine Cable," David said while reading the report. "We found her fingerprints all over Stephen McGuire's room, including the headboard. I think it might be a good bet that DNA tests will show that the vaginal fluid we found on the sheets was hers, too. Her prints were in the database from when she used to be a school teacher. Now she's a bartender at your inn." Clutching the bruise over his right eye, Mac moaned. "I'm beginning to hate the sound of that." "Sound of what?" "Your inn." David chuckled. "We'll drop you off at the manor and..." "No," Mac said. "I want to know why my bartender is slipping between the sheets with my guests. I'm not running one of those types of establishments. Take me to the inn. While I'm there, I want a drink." After calling Jeff Ingle to ask when Justine would be working next, he told David, "She's on duty now." During the mid-afternoon lull before the early dinner hour, the lounge was empty, except for a couple nuzzling in the corner booth by the fireplace. A curvaceous woman wearing thick makeup, Justine Cable was cleaning the last of the glasses to get the bar ready for the happy hour crowd. When David stepped up to the bar in the civilian clothes he'd changed into at the hospital after their accident, she snapped, "Lunchtime is over. We won't be serving the dinner menu until 4 o'clock. When she saw Mac turn from where he was admiring the view of the mountaintops on the horizon, her attitude softened. "Unless you want us to open earlier, Mr. Faraday." "I'm not interested in lunch. I need a drink." Noticing the bruise on his forehead, hospital ID bracelet, and his disheveled appearance, she agreed. "What happened to you, sir?" "I was in a head-on collision with a German shepherd." Mac climbed up onto a stool and slapped David on the back, hitting his dislocated shoulder. "What do you want? It's on the house." "Anything?" David hesitated. "You do like cognac, don't you?" "Yeah, but..." Mac turned to Justine. 2 snifters of cognac from my special reserve. Make it Camus Jubilee. David grinned. Jubilee, Dad's favorite. I was only allowed to have it a couple of times. Then this should be a treat. Camus Jubilee was a special blend of the oldest cognac. Robin Spencer had a special collection of the most expensive and decadent wines, champagnes, and spirits reserved for herself and her special guests. Now they belonged to Mac. He still didn't know the complete inventory. Archie had been gradually introducing it to him and his taste buds. Mac feared that he was becoming horribly spoiled. After Justine delivered the drinks, Mac held up his snifter to David's in a toast. To murder, the ultimate puzzle. Some people do crossword puzzles. Mac Faraday solves murders. David swirled the liquor in the snifter before savoring a sip of it. Both men groaned with pleasure while the smooth spirits slid down their throats. Better than sex, Mac declared. Equal to, but not better, David countered. Mac chuckled when he thought about how long it had been since he'd been with a woman. When I was your age, I thought the same thing. Funny how age has a way of shifting your priorities. Now you prefer cognac to a fine woman? David asked. Tell me the truth. If you had to choose between a snifter of Jubilee and an evening alone with Archie, which would you choose? Mac grinned. You've forgotten that I spend most evenings alone with Archie. Have you forgotten about Gnarly? Gnarly doesn't count. You want me to tell him you said that? David laughed. Out of the corner of his eye, Mac saw Justine listening to the conversation while trying to appear busy completing her inventory checklist. She was good at appearing nonchalant. The tilt of her head in their direction gave her away. How long you been working here, Justine? He asked so abruptly that she dropped her pen to the floor. After retrieving the pen, she smiled broadly at him. 4 years. You married? Divorced. Did you know Stephen McGuire? David held up his badge for her to see. The man killed here at the inn. No, she said quickly. I served him a couple of drinks, but that was it. I didn't know him. In silence they sipped their drinks. Max set his drink down at the bar and peered up at her. You are aware that we have security cameras all over the place, Justine. Her cheeks turned a bright shade of pink. All right. All we did was have sex. That was it. Nothing else. I didn't know him, except in the biblical sense. I didn't really know him. I mean, I knew nothing about him except that he was a big lawyer and knew lots of important people and he was great in bed. That's all. She waved her hands and the bar's dish rag like it was a flag while repeating, It was sex, nothing else. Mac nodded his head. Okay, I get it. You had sex with Stephen McGuire and nothing else. He was in here for drinks Friday night and we hit it off, she rambled on. He invited me up to his room, and we were attracted to each other. In a choked voice, she asked, Am I going to get fired for this? Were you on the clock when you had sex with him? No. Good, Mac answered, because I don't want a reputation for running that type of hotel. We can have murder, but no sex on the clock. David asked, Where and when did you have sex with Stephen McGuire? His room. Saturday afternoon, she said. I went up to his room around 1 o'clock. I was on duty at 4. I was there a few hours. We made a date for lunch. He'd sent for room service, fruit and cheese and strawberries dipped in chocolate. Giggling, she twisted the dish rag in her hands. But we didn't eat that much. He was really great. Uncomfortable with her discussing the sexual prowess of the man with whom his wife had cheated on him, Mac shifted in his seat, took a large sip of his drink, and rubbed his aching head. David resumed the interview. Did he talk to anyone while you were there? Get or make any phone calls or texts? She shook her head before changing her mind. I take that back. He did get a phone call. They got into an argument. I remember thinking he sounded like those hardball lawyers you see on television. Mac asked, Do you remember the conversation? She proceeded to wipe down the bar with the dish rag. It had to be a woman because they were talking about her husband. Mac and David exchanged glances. He was telling her that he wanted to talk to her about her husband's case, she said slowly while recalling. I guess she wanted to know why, and he said because the case had come to his attention, and he thought there had maybe been some irregularities about it. That was the word he used, irregularities. I guess she didn't want to talk to him because then he said, and this was when he started talking hardball, it was a real turn-on, too. Focus on what was said, Mac directed her. He asked her if she knew Randolph McGuire. I don't know who that is, Justine said. He's a high-ranking official with the IRS, Mac told her. Oh, she said. Well, he told her that this McGuire dude was his uncle, and one phone call from him and he could have her company come to a grinding halt with audits, and she'd be up to her eyeballs in IRS agents. Then they made an appointment to meet later on for dinner. Dinner, Mac repeated. And this was Saturday? She nodded her head quickly. David clarified. They met for dinner on Saturday night? I guess, Justine said. I saw him having dinner with some woman. She didn't look like she was having a good time either. Is that any help? Mac jumped when he felt a strong hand clasp his shoulder. You look like you've been hit by a truck. Garrett County Prosecutor Ben Fleming had decided to make his presence known. With his blond good looks and upscaled style, he resembled a golf pro more than he did a lawyer. Judging by his athletic togs, he'd been visiting the club on the ground floor. He looked the inn's owner up and down. Even with the layer of sweat, Ben Fleming's breeding was several degrees more evident than Mac's. As you can see, Mac went several rounds with Gnarly and lost, David explained. And you? David touched the sling on David's arm. The curl in his lip told him he'd already heard via the Spencer grapevine. T-boned by a van full of geezers, David said. You should see the van. Ben gestured for Justine to serve him a snifter of the same cognac they were having. After getting his, he invited them to join him in the sitting area around the fireplace. By the way, Chief, I got a call about you this morning, Ben said, before slipping into a pub chair. They could only imagine which suspect had called the county prosecutor to complain about David. It could have been anyone from Judge Sutherland to Natasha Homestead to Hamilton Sanders. Sabrina Carrington, Ben announced. My sister-in-law? Mac corrected himself. Ex-sister-in-law? Ben smiled into his snifter. She claims she was assaulted by our chief of police. Before David could reply to the accusation, Mac argued, In defense of me. He showed Ben the scratches on his cheek, which the bruise on his forehead had made him forget. David told her to stand down, and she refused. He had no choice but shove her back. That's all it was. The prosecutor said she claims he tackled her and manhandled her breasts in the process. It's like Mac said, David replied. She was out of control. I warned her to back off, and she continued the assault on Mac. I ended it. How big was this woman? David hesitated, then revealed that while Sabrina wasn't very tall, she was hefty weight, which caused the prosecutor to chuckle at the image of the athletic young police chief taking down a heavy-set middle-aged woman in defense of Mac. You haven't met this woman, Mac told him. Sabrina Carrington can be as mean as a snake when she's riled, which happens frequently. In that case, don't worry about it. Ben dismissed the matter with a smirk. I'll handle it. Other than Mac's out-of-control relatives, ex-relatives, Mac corrected him, ex-in-laws. Ex-relatives, Ben repeated. How's it going otherwise? Any headway we can speak of? We're making some headway. Relieved that the prosecutor wasn't taking Sabrina's complaint seriously, Mac sat back into the chair. We have an APB out on Hamilton Sanders. He was Stephen McGuire's assistant. David explained he has to know what this Themis is. Archie is searching the internet to find a common denominator about all the names on the list we found in McGuire's folder. We believe it has to be more than they all got off for murder, especially since someone took a shot at us and killed Bonnie Probst, the widow of one of the defendants on the list. Do keep me informed about any developments. In a casual tone, Ben announced, I got an interesting phone call from a friend of mine, Broderick McGuire. Broderick McGuire is a friend of yours? Max sensed rather than knew that Ben, who came from old money, was well connected. He appreciated that the prosecutor didn't indulge in name-dropping. Even so, he would have thought that if his friend was connected to billionaire Broderick McGuire, he would have mentioned it at some point. "You're the one he called," David said. "We've been wondering why we haven't heard anything from the McGuires, wanting to know the status of our investigation." "I went to college with Broderick's youngest son," Ben explained. "Straight-up guy. You never would have known that he came from so much money and political power." "What did you tell Broderick?" Mac asked. Ben scratched the side of his head. "Don't you want to know what he was asking me about first?" "Okay, I'll bite," Mac said. "What did he want to know?" "He wanted to know why he and his family have been getting all these calls from the media asking how they felt about some dude they'd never heard of getting killed at the Spencer Inn." Forgetting about his aching head, Mac jerked upright in his seat. "What? Some dude they've never heard of?" Ben chuckled. "I don't know where you got the idea that Stephen McGuire was any relation. Broderick said he has no grandson named Stephen. He's got 23 grandchildren, but none of them are named Stephen. He's got a nephew named Stephen, but he is a retired dentist in Florida. To Broderick McGuire's knowledge, he's never even been to the Spencer Inn." Mac spat out. "He lied. McGuire lied about belonging to the McGuire family." "Is his name even McGuire?" Ben asked. "David ran a background check on him." Mac pointed in David's direction in an accusing manner. "It said that he'd gone to Ohio State University. I thought that was odd because I was told he went to Oxford." Ben said, "Then his name may be McGuire, but he's not related to the McGuires." "That's why he never introduced Christine to his family, because they weren't his family." Mac felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. All the years he'd known Stephen McGuire, he'd bought the lie as well. He put up with McGuire's arrogance because of the family connections he believed he had. Who lies about things like that? "Con men," Ben answered. "And the con worked," Mac said. "Hunter put Stephen McGuire on the fast track, specifically because he wanted his family's endorsement for Attorney General. Wealthy women supported him in the lifestyle of the rich and famous, with the promise of being part of high society as soon as Grandpa McGuire kicked the bucket and he came into his share of the family dynasty." "It happens all the time," Ben said, with a shrug of his shoulders. "Con men say they're from money, but it's tied up in a trust or an overseas bank. They flash enough cash around to convince you that it's true." Max said, "The U.S. attorney bought it. Washington bought it. McGuire had a lot of influence. I was ordered by my supervisors to walk on eggshells around him for fear of his wrath against them." Mac's fury rose. "McGuire has probably been playing this con ever since hitting Washington. It probably started when someone asked if he was any relation to those McGuires, and he said yes. When he saw people bowing down to kiss his feet without actually checking to see if he was telling the truth, he took a liking to it and decided to start living it. Then he conned women, like Christine, into supporting him in that lifestyle with the promise of being introduced into high society." Ben held up a hand to study his manicured fingertips. "Living the debutante life has a high overhead." He gestured at Mac's worn and discolored jacket. "If you got more into it, you'd see that for yourself." "I prefer my jackets broken in, thank you." Mac brushed his fingers over the worn leather of his 3-year-old jacket. "If McGuire wasn't already dead, I'd fill him full of bullets and dump his body in the lake." "What did I just hear?" David asked.